All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my channel. My name, as you all know, if you've been watching me for a while, my name is Dr. Anwar Yusuf Dunbar, and this is, hold on. My name is Dr. Anwar Yusuf Dunbar, and this is Big Discussions 76, Science and Technology. Just give me 1 second, actually more than a second, and I'm going to share this over on the community tab of my original channel, so folks over there can come in and listen in if they want to listen in. We're going to have a fun discussion today, and a very educational one, and we'll get that started shortly. Just let me send this notification. Make sure I spell this correctly. Epigenetics. All right, that's posted. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to that channel and hang out over there so I can get the most up-to-date metadata. All right, let's get this started. All right, so I'm using a nice hard connection on my PC, so I'm not going to get the grainy thing going on. Hopefully, not transmitting over to YouTube. So let's get this started. So guys, today, happy Sunday. Today is July 11th, 2021. We're gonna talk about epigenetics today. And I'm going to be joined by the Nameless Protagonist. I think mostly everyone in the sphere, as he calls it, or the space, knows who Nameless is. And we're going to talk about epigenetics, what it is, and what potential role the environment plays on human health and communities, and what populations of people go on to become. So if you're new coming in, or if you're just coming in, please hit the like, please share. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe. And also, if you're watching over on the Facebook side, please like this stream as well. So I'm going to say a few things here, and then I'm going to bring Nameless up. Let me take a look at my notes here. So this channel is about science and technology. And I started it because I wanted to, raise awareness, particularly in communities like mine. I wanted to raise awareness of the STEMs and talk about the STEMs that I'm proficient in and knowledgeable in, but also I wanted to invite other individuals on, but I wanted to make myself visible for young people like me who had the ability and the kind of the building blocks to do science, but didn't see STEM professionals around in their families and in their communities. So that's one of the reasons why I started this channel. And I think that in communities like mine, their science is not talked about and discussed all the time unless there's some sort of national disaster or catastrophe like the one we've experienced over the last year. So I want to do my part to introduce these discussions into communities where people aren't talking about this stuff, and people don't even know that this stuff exists. In previous, okay, I see one person I recognize. Hello, Kareem. Thank you for coming, as always. Always good to see you in the chat. As a brief recap, a couple of streams ago, I did a, I read this piece right here. It's the story of how I earned my STEM degree. So this piece right here, I created a live stream just off of that. And the reason I wanted to do that was to kind of discuss my experience as someone coming from the east side of Buffalo, which is predominantly a Black community. I wanted to talk about what that was like, and just to start to lay the framework and the groundwork for others who might come after me, who might embark on the same adventure, because there were a lot of ups and downs during that journey, and I just wanted to do something on that. But I also, a few streams before that, I also devoted a whole stream just to part one of my graduate thesis. And just briefly, I'm going to try to be brief here. And just briefly, what my graduate thesis was about, it involved the enzyme. And I'm going to show this picture again. Neuronal nitric oxide synthase. That's a ribbon diagram. It's a homodimer. It catalyzes the production of nitric oxide from L-arginine, which is an amino acid. But we were looking at how this enzyme is regulated within the cell by drugs, because my background is in pharmacology. And what we found was that it was regulated through this system here called the 26S proteasome and ubiquitination system. And since then, I've been cutting off little excerpts of that stream. I would encourage you to go and listen to it. It might be a challenge if you've never heard those terms, and if you don't have a background in that area, it might be a challenge. But again, the whole goal is to get the information out and to start to get people and communities of people thinking about these things, which they otherwise would not be thinking about. So I went ahead and I cut off little snippets of that live stream to kind of break down some of the techniques used and just to break down some of the background information as well, in little bits and pieces, so people can go back and listen. Some of it might sound like gibberish, but I would encourage viewers to just kind of sit and think and try to understand, because part of when you're listening to someone talk about science, a major part of that is understanding the methodologies and the techniques that they used to perform those experiments. So I uploaded an excerpt discussing what a cellular transfection is and why that's important. I uploaded an excerpt discussing what SF9 expression systems are, in addition to column chromatography. So I uploaded that. I also uploaded an excerpt discussing what this 26S proteasome system is. So if you haven't, I would encourage you to go take a look back at those. And as you'll see, once Nameless comes up, what's going on? Sheed's here. What's going on, Sheed? Thank you for being here. As you'll see, when Nameless comes up, and I've had Nicole on my channel, and I'll probably show up back up on her channel. All these things, they all fit together. You know, you have these separate parts over here. We have pharmacology, epigenetics, cancer biology. All these things eventually intersect somewhere. Now, today, when me and Nameless start talking about epigenetics, the The underlying question, as I see it, is going to be, how does the environment affect us? How does the environment affect our health? How does our environment affect our bodies, and how our physical beings respond down to the genetic level? So I'm gonna read a post here, a very short post from my blogging platform, which I think is going to set this up really, really well. Let's see. This post is entitled, let me share it for you guys. And I have a blogging platform, and I've been trying to figure out how to use my YouTube to promote that, and vice versa. So again, I think this folds really, really well into what we're going to talk about. So this is entitled 4 Ways Technology Has Completely Transformed the Way Your Brain Works. And I think Nameless will probably, what we talk about, we're probably going to come back to technology as well, because I've heard him talk about technology before. So this reads, 2 focuses of my blog are health and wellness and technology. While all of our new technologies have added to our lives, the question must be asked as to whether or not it hurts us as well. The following contributed post is entitled 4 Ways Technology Has Completely Transformed the Way Your Brain Works. So this is for teaching purposes, for YouTube, for the YouTube algorithm, or the YouTube Pilot Bureau, or whoever is watching this. This is for teaching and educational purposes only. And it reads as follows. There's no denying that technology has improved our lives in a lot of ways. The internet has given us access to more information than ever and connected people across the globe. Businesses have benefited from technology that helps them improve productivity and save money, but there are some big downsides to technology as well. This channel got taken down a couple of months ago, and YouTube was nice enough to put it back up. Over-reliance on technology has actually changed the way that our brains work in a number of ways. It's important that we are aware of this so we can take steps to combat those effects. These are some of the ways that technology has completely changed the way our brains work. So everyone keep that in mind. How has the environment, or how does the environment impact how the physiologies of our bodies? In this instance, is our brains, but other organ systems as well, down to the DNA level. Fear of missing out, or FOMO. I guess this is a new acronym out there. The fear of missing out, or FOMO for short, isn't a new concept, but it's one that has been made much worse by social media. In the past, if people spent a weekend sitting at home relaxing, they might have had some sense that they were missing out on some fun by not going out. However, they also enjoyed the time to recharge their batteries and relax. But these days, we are constantly bombarded with images and videos of people out doing things and having a good time. This leads to a lot of anxiety and guilt when people decide to look after themselves and spend a night in. Over time, this can contribute to wider mental health problems, so it's a serious issue. Let's see. A decline in spelling abilities. When you were at school, you were probably pretty good at spelling because you did regular tests and you were always writing by hand. But how good are you at spelling these days? A reliance on technology and autocorrect software means that spelling ability is getting worse. In order to combat this, you should try to write by hand wherever possible, or consider turning spell checkers off to see if you can do it, without them. You can also improve your spelling by doing puzzles like crosswords. So consider getting a subscription and doing them regularly. As long as you are proactive about testing your spelling skills, you can counteract the negative effect of technology. Poor sleep patterns. The blue light emitted from phone and laptop screens can change your brain chemistry and make it harder for us to sleep. This is because it interrupts the body's normal light cues, making it think that it's still daytime. As a result, your body produces less of the hormones that cause you to go to sleep, and your natural sleep cycle is disrupted. This is a huge problem because lack of sleep does a lot of damage to your health. Improved sleep patterns are one of the biggest benefits of taking a break from technology for a while. And then finally, phantom vibration. Studies show that our brains have been hardwired to be on the lookout for our phones ringing, even when they are not. Research into phantom vibrations found that people experienced a sensation of their phone vibrating in their pocket throughout the course of the day when it wasn't. Even though this isn't a huge problem, it just goes to show how much impact technology can have on our brains. If you want to develop a healthy relationship with technology, it is important to recognize the ways that it has completely transformed the way your brain works. Okay. So once again, everyone, think about how the environment has changed and how we're changing with it. I'm going to take a quick look over at YouTube to make sure everything is fine. Okay. All right. Everything is still fine over on the YouTube side. When I did that stream a couple of months ago and it got taken down, everything looked fine over here on StreamYard. And then when I went over to YouTube, it was gone. Okay. So Nameless is going to click the link and I'm going to talk for a few minutes and then he's going to come back and I'm going to bring him up. So you all know that I have a background in pharmacology. And pharmacology, stop screen share. And all these next few minutes, this is just to create a nice backdrop for what we're going to talk about. So you all know my background is in pharmacology. Pharmacology basically is the basic research or the basic science behind the drugs that we use for therapeutic purposes and also in some instances for pleasure, sometimes illegally. Some people do. But the point is that there's a whole science behind it. And I've talked about that up to this point on this channel. As part of our curriculum and no matter which biomedical science you get into, it could be biochemistry, it could be protein, it could be cell biology, it could be physiology, it could be pharmacology, toxicology, microbiology, whichever one you get into, you're always going to come back to DNA. You haven't seen this in a while. This is my trusty DNA model. So everything, we're always going to go back to DNA. And in some of my early videos on this channel, I went over transcription and translation. And what you're thinking about when you're thinking about transcription and translation is first, you are, we know that all of our animal cells, because we are a part of the animal kingdom. Let me pull this picture up really quickly. So we're human beings. Human beings are considered a part of the animal kingdom. And all of the organs in our bodies are made up of billions and billions of these cells. These are eukaryotic cells. Each has a nucleus, cytoplasm, numerous organelles inside that cytoplasm, a cell membrane, and so on, et cetera, et cetera. And so what happens with, I consider proteins to be the workhorses of the cells, because those carry out the actual functions, and those, it's the result of proteins doing what they do that you see on the whole animal and the whole organism level. But where do those proteins come from? Those proteins actually come from nucleic acids, DNA and RNA. And that process, the process of creating RNA from DNA, is called transcription. And then the process of generating those proteins from the RNA, that's called translation. And here's another nice cartoon of that. You can see this in the cell. You have your DNA strand right there inside of the cell. And that's probably the nucleus. Yeah, so you have the nucleus there. You're creating an RNA strand. And that strand goes into the cytoplasm, to the ribosome, where the proteins are made. I've talked about numerous proteins on this channel, and I'm going to show you some ribbon diagrams of some of those proteins. This is a ribbon diagram of the ACE2 receptor. I'm not going to go into too much detail about what this ACE2 receptor is and does, but I'll just say that it's related to I'm drawing a blank here. The amount of fluid you have, your water retention, the amount of fluid you have circulating through your body, that's in part dictated by the ACE2 receptor. And also the ACE2 receptor was involved in the pandemic that we've been in for the last year. So that's been a key player in the pandemic. And I'll just stop it there, because YouTube doesn't want us talking about certain things. This is a ribbon diagram of hemoglobin. That's a tetramer. We know that hemoglobin carries oxygen from our lungs to our extremities, and it carries carbon dioxide from our extremities back to our lungs, so we can exhale that carbon dioxide back into the environment. This is nitric oxide synthase. This is the enzyme I worked on during my graduate thesis. It catalyzes the production of nitric oxide from L-arginine, which, and that nitric oxide does numerous things depending upon the tissue that it's being generated in. And this is the ribbon diagram of a cytochrome P450 enzyme. That's a major drug metabolizing enzyme family class that's found in the liver. But I'm showing all of this to show you and to impress upon the fact that these are proteins. The proteins carry out the functions in our bodies, and the sequences for those proteins all come from our nucleic acids, our DNA. Even this protease system that I worked on as a graduate student and that I researched, we all have this protease system in the cells in our bodies. In addition to others, the sequences for that protease and the other proteins associated with that protease all come from our DNA. Okay. And our bodies have mechanisms for degrading proteins and also creating proteins. So the question then is, or another way to approach this is, we know that we inherit this DNA, these nucleic acids from our parents, and they inherited theirs from our grandparents, and so on, et cetera, et cetera. But is the talking just within our bodies themselves, or can the outside environment, represented by this picture here, this is a picture of the numerous spheres of the planet Earth, but can the outside environment talk to the DNA within our bodies and cause certain changes and certain modifications throughout our lives, and then even throughout generations? So can the environment impact our health and what happens to us as individuals, and also us as a species and communities? Well, it turns out that there have been a lot of talks about this. This is a field called epigenetics, which me and Nameless are going to discuss when I bring him up shortly. And basically, what the field is looking at is how the environment impacts our genetic material, how that genetic material expresses, and how it impacts us on the individual level, and also as communities, and also as cultures, and also as a species. That's epigenetics. And just a few basics, because I'm not an expert in epigenetics, and I actually did watch 3 TED Talks on this over the last couple of days. And I also read a couple of things that Nameless shared with me, which we'll probably talk about. But I left those 3 TED Talks below in case you're unfamiliar with them. But just 2 brief concepts here that you want to think about is that genes can be turned on and off. And it turns out that our genes on our chromosomes are arranged in these structures called nucleosomes. Those purple balls are called histones, which are protein structures themselves. And those histones can, and Nicole, if you're out there, Nameless, you can correct me when you come up. Those histones can methylate DNA, turning that DNA on and off, because what DNA does, DNA has promoter regions. I think I have a picture of that here somewhere loaded up. Yeah, I'll show the glucocorticoid receptor. So our chromosomes have promoter regions where transcription factors actually bind and give rise to the proteins that are needed at that particular time. And since I have this picture of the glucocorticoid receptor, and since I just told you guys about those TED Talks, I'm sure Nameless has heard this story before. In one of the TED Talks, and actually maybe 2 out of the 3, and I haven't looked at this data myself, but there have been experiments showing that you have 2 cohorts of rats. In one cohort over here, the mothers were very vigilant about nursing their children and showing love and affection and nursing and attention, showing those things to their offspring. And then you have this cohort over here where the mothers were more neglectful of their offspring. And according to this data, and I'll have to look this up to see for myself, but those 2 cohorts, those offspring, expressed the glucocorticoid receptor differently. And the reason that's important is because the glucocorticoid receptor is involved with stress responses. So the children who were shown that affection and that attention and that motherly care early, those offspring were able to cope much better than the offspring that were not. And so when you translate that into when you think about human populations, because we do use rodents as models for humans and human health, that makes you wonder, okay, what happens when human children are not properly cared for, or when human children are raised in less than optimal environments, and when human children are not even shown love and care and affection when they're young? What happens to those human children? And a hypothesis is that the same thing happens. They're not as well adjusted, and they have problems coping with life and coping with stress as they get older. But guys, I've talked for enough. That's a little introduction. Those are some of the pieces me and Nameless are going to be talking about during this discussion. So with that, I'm going to bring up the Nameless Protagonist, and he will talk to us about how the environment can impact us, and how culture may impact us as well. Hello, Nameless.
Os, can you hear me?
Os, I can hear you.
To the chat, Os, it's good to be up here. Yes, the model that you brought forward is going to be a very good illustration to kind of get us started on what we're really talking about here, which is really getting into the designation of there being the DNA as a written script set in stone, figuratively speaking, and the way that script is expressed. And when we talk about the way that script is expressed, oftentimes when people think about DNA, they're really talking about what is expressed in that moment because we see the end result of that. And I think it's important when we have these conversations to understand that epigenetics is not something, or rather, DNA is not something so much set in stone, that it does matter the way that DNA is expressed. And in the context of culture and family dynamics and inheritance in particular, environment plays not only a speculative role, it plays a critical role, especially when we're talking about reproduction, because what happens to the sex organs literally gets translated to the next generation. And I think the key thing here is that generational transference. I'm digressing a little bit, but I want to preface, our conversation with this to kind of put this into perspective. I want to demystify DNA for our conversation. I want to demystify epigenetics and remove it from the realm of speculative science. Even though, we'll put the pause here, we know that science in general is an ongoing canon. When we say epigenetics, it's not that this is speculative and that it's something that's pop or recent. This is being used as de facto. There are a lot of drugs that are being produced now that are designed to induce methylation, for example, especially in the field of cancer treatments. And I'm pretty sure Dr. Nicole can really get into a lot of detail about that because some of what she does is predicated on manipulating that genetic expression of something. That's epigenetics. That's not speculative. Like, we know this is a function of our cells. So what we need is a revitalizing of the topic of DNA, because when we speak about these things, this is actually good news to know that these things are epigenetic, because just like the way something can change because of an environment, human beings have agency over their immediate environment and therefore can affect change on the epigenome as well, consciously. In other words, these behaviors can be acted upon with corrective action. It doesn't have to stay that way. And it begins with being aware with this. I think a good study to begin with, I'm going to send a link in the back chat because I don't have the ability to link on your channel yet, Dr. Anwar.
Okay.
But that link there for people's records, it speaks about the epigenetic conditioning mechanism that they can use to instill fear in a group of mice, or just in general. That, and there's been several different ways they've done this experiment, but one in particular, they conditioned a particular scent to a group of mice to be shocked every time they smelled that scent. And so they did this to the point where it was a conditioned response, much like that bell experiment where the bell rung and the dogs had a saliva. That's what we talk about when we're bringing up a conditioned response. So they were able to condition a fear conditioned response in these mice. And when they got exposed to the scent, they were fearful because they would get a shock every time the scent showed up. And they were able to not only have the offspring experience this, even though they never got exposed to the shocking. When they heard that smell, that conditioned fear response was remembered in the next generation, and then the generation after that, and the generation after that. All of this being simply an epigenetic change where, and I think this is kind of the way our DNA is designed to operate anyway. It was a adaptation to the environment to remember if this, then express that behavior. And I think that's really the mechanics behind it all. That's the calculus going on a biological level to prepare you to adapt to a certain environment. Now, there are a lot of implications for this, not just with, as people are seeing with psychological issues and disorders, But with groups of people and cultures, where culture serves as a form of environment for you as human beings, you've got your immediate civilization. And within that civilization, there are different cultures that will be employed there, that are adopting to whatever immediate environment they have and family settings that they have. They're there adopting to what it is that their objectives are, so that they can make the next generation have better odds for survival. That's generally how that plays out. So there's a gap from the actual environment interfacing with the civilization, meeting into the culture, and then finally expressing itself with the individual. And since human beings require so much from their immediate environment, like the parents, to provide for them examples and illustrations, a lot of the calibration occurs in the womb to the environment you come out of. So if the parents are experiencing a measure of stress, for example, like this, it's not only possible, but very likely that's being passed on to the children, and they're going to have conditioned responses to the same things that you had a response to, especially if it's a situation where you're in that 9-month period of gestation, because all that separates you is that blood barrier from the placenta to the actual mother. And a lot of this information is right there in your genetic sequence. And here you are sharing the same system effectively. A lot of this information can be transferred via mRNA, microRNA. And here you are in this developmental process, vicariously experiencing these things, creating all of these different instances of methylation that could be transferring all kinds of conditioned behavior that you're just completely unaware of, which again emphasizes the historical importance of the family being its own isolated sphere of protection to keep itself out of these negative experiences. But I really wanted to draw the line and connection, because I think in the field of psychology, a lot of this has been understood and expressed when people will talk about how a lot of mental illness is on a genetic basis. And there's a tendency to think that when you say it's genetic like that, that it's like a death sentence, that you're absolutely going to get it. Like the infamous, I'll defer to cancer a little bit, the infamous BRCA gene. I'm sure you heard a bit about that with, folks had that whole BRCA mutation or whatever, that particular cluster of proteins or that particular gene sequence. If you had any kind of mutation with the BRCA gene, folks just pretty much assumed that they were going to get cancer, especially, dealing with breast or cervical cancer. And they were just going out preemptively and just getting things removed out the gate. We know now that it isn't so much about whether or not you've got the genetic predisposition, which is what that would be, but it's the way in which it's expressed. You need to have a measure of the environment also assisting and triggering that so that it can become negative. Stacked on top of that, having a BRCA mutation doesn't necessarily mean that it's for the worse. It can also help you in recovering from those cells getting into becoming cancer cells, essentially. We need to go back to this theme of on and off predicated on the environment. And it applies not just to things related to disease, but I think we see it most acutely with behavior. And culture serves as such a strong repository for behavioral dispositions that you could literally be affecting your genome in a positive or negative way based on your immediate surroundings, especially in those very sensitive formative years from the ages of 0 through 7. When I say 0, I'm counting the gestation period.
Okay. Yeah. So from what I gathered from what you just said, Nameless, at least in the end, you just ended with the environment. So then one of the things I was thinking about was if you start tailoring the environment, in certain ways, aren't you also tailoring the health, the disease states, the characteristics of the people in those environments?
Absolutely. And there's a term that's getting very popular because there's some overlap to this with transhumanism. And I guess it's kind of in the realm of philosophy at this point, this term self-directed evolution. And folks would make the point that the idea of civilization or civilizing a group of people is precisely that. Having a particular set of ideas geared towards producing an end result of a group of people able to function in a particular way by manipulating the environment that creates conditions favorable to getting that done. That is what you could call being acculturated in a nutshell. But I guess a more common term is just simply upbringing. And absolutely, if you gain immediate control of that environment, and you can even break it down to a very base level with food you consume. Food is probably an excellent place to start because there are food cultures. And oftentimes these food cultures are created because they take what the immediate environment a group of people are living in. They find different combinations of foods that help them meet their nutritional needs. But oftentimes that comes with a way that your body responds to it. So one thought that comes to mind is how things like diabetes and obesity are in the realm of epigenetics. These are things that change the way your genes are expressed. I know recently they did an experiment where they took folks from South Africa, a lot of the indigenous folks out there, the Xhosa and the Zulu, and they gave them the standard American diet. Then they took some African Americans and did the exact same thing, but they gave the African Americans a group of the traditional food a lot of the folks in South Africa were eating. And what they found was rates of obesity and blood pressure and all of that, all the negative metabolic issues that you're concerned with went away when African Americans were eating the South African food culture. And a lot of the traditional metabolic problems you see in the West were manifesting in the South Africans that were eating the American diet, the standard American diet. So this is an example of how, when you get into, and I'll attribute this to gut biome, your immediate environment just within yourself with the food you introduce has changes to your epigenetics. And in fact, there's a massive overlap going on right now with research where they're treating a lot of diseases by addressing what's going on in the gut biome by adding food and supplement, because they're finding that there is a neurological connection to a lot of these mental illnesses, including depression, by having, a lack of certain nutrients. All of that is epigenetics.
Right. If anyone wants to make a donation to the channel, I don't have a super chat on this one yet because I don't have 1,000 subs over here, but my Cash App is there. My PayPal is below this stream as well. So Nameless, so a couple of years ago, I here in DC, I covered an event for examiner.com. It was on the school to prison pipeline, and Delta Sigma Theta actually hosted that one. And one of the speakers, I think it was that talk, one of the speakers said that children from underserved communities, everyone, I'm not a neuroscientist, but she did say that the folds and the shapes of their brains were different than the children from other communities. And so the take-home message was that there are, based upon the environments that these children are being raised in, that environment is exerting certain long-term behavioral and, as I just described, structural changes on those children, which manifests in their ability to sit and learn in class. I'm going to show the audience something. I showed this picture of the glucocorticoid receptor here, and the speaker. So what happens is with that's called a nuclear hormone receptor. So any hormone that your body produces, I'm thinking about the cholesterol derivatives, they bind to a receptor in the cytosol basically, and that goes and it binds DNA and it activates certain regions of that DNA to give rise to proteins. But I'm saying that to say that I'm thinking about fight or flight response.
Yeah, because the first thing that comes to mind is what is it called? I just had it on my mind. Cortisol.
Cortisol. Yep.
Yep. And there we go with that. And even the presence of cortisol has so many metabolic effects on the way you develop as a child. Like too much exposure to that literally begins to set the stage for things like PTSD in kids. It sets the tone for, negative framing of mind of certain things. And well, we can just keep it on a neurological level. In the presence of cortisol, when those hormones are really going off in balance like that, they actually impede neurological activity in a lot of ways. In other words, you can literally instill learning disorders by having such high stress environments like that and creating conditioned responses to the environment that distract from all of that. And it gets in the way, like unquestioningly, with the child's development and the way they're going to perceive the world. And I think, it's just such a commonplace to use the exception as the rule. But what I don't think is appreciated is how widespread this is to the point where it's baked into the culture. It's almost like a rite of passage to get exposed to such high levels of stress. And it's normalized to the point where, the culture ends up almost crippling people out the gate. And we have to really overinflate the achievements of the individuals that do make it, but they don't make it out without this trauma. And it may be, a matter of modern society going in this direction as a whole. But just like the link I sent you not that long ago, where they were showing how a lot of these epigenetic changes, they can stay for over 300 generations. We don't appreciate how things that we could be experiencing now are things that are left over from a period that doesn't even exist anymore. And how things we do now can have implications on what our children experience down the line. And that's where I'm at with a lot of this stuff. We can prevent that mindset, but only if we understand that the environment really needs to take precedence in those early years, because the body, the brain, and the biochemistry is learning its general algorithm. It's setting the pace for what is normal. It's calibrating to the environment to state, what do I need to produce to attain homeostasis? What is going to give me balance? And if the environment is saying, here's this hyper stressful thing, we need you to calibrate for stress, it's going to do that. But it's going to do that at the expense of other things. And these things that are at the expense of may not make sense when you get into the environment that you're supposed to be, which is the school environment. So I'll give a case in point to this. If you look at our instance, and we'll just use the Northern Virginia area, the DMV as an example. You already know at home you're getting a particular environment from the ages of 1 through 6. That looks nothing like what happens when suddenly you have to register and go to the county school, or you go to DC public schools. You're expected to behave in a completely different context than what you were calibrated for. Whereas other communities are able to calibrate their kids at a much earlier state in a much stabler environment. And as a result, when they get into the formal education dynamic, they're far more calibrated to adjust to these things so they can get more out of that. Like, this is just an immediate way that culture can have, long-term changes on that. And, it gets very uncomfortable, since I suppose that we don't have the class conversation, because it's a real strong implication of class potentially with a lot of these things, because it's assumed that if you've got the money, then you've got the expendable resources to create that environment. Like, my mom graduated, for example, from Georgia. It's not Georgia Tech, Georgetown. So she got to see the difference in individuals who come from certain backgrounds that had certain environments that could produce that kind of upbringing, and the probability of getting into these advanced programs simply for being calibrated for it, and the long-term effects of that down the line, and other groups of people who didn't get that opportunity. And it really plays out not with the individual, but when you take a step back and look at the metadata, when you look at the general data overall, it really shows itself. And I think it's what gives, and I'm slightly digressing, but I want to give an immediate comparison. I think it's the key thing that helps us digress from groups of people who migrate over here, because their environments are predicated on being able to survive and get into these environments. So I believe I was listening to WTOP's brother Teapot's channel, and he had the PhDs up there, and they were talking about, you know, how important it is that when you get a doctor, the rearing process for that really begins in early childhood development. If you don't have an immediate environment that fosters the intention to develop the discipline and the social skills required to get to that point, the chances of you getting that and following through are very rare. Very rare. It is an exception to the rule. And when you look at we've got, you know, exceptions. But when you look at the Asian demographic, for example, as a whole, they're overrepresented for the number of people that are over here. And I really believe that has a lot to do with the immediate environment they find themselves in, because they are a trajectory from a prior group of people who already had poor environments. Because it's silly to think that, we'll use China for an example, that most people out there are on these PhD levels of intelligence and capability and potential. There's an overwhelming number of people who are nowhere near that. It's just the ones that get the trajectory over here are coming from a focused pool that already had to have discipline to get out there. So when they get here, that culture of discipline is continued almost to a fault. So when you can see the same pattern, you can even take a look at individuals who come over here from the continent. It's almost the exact same story every time. You've got a trajectory. So there's a certain sphere of culture that's there that keeps certain ideas in that nucleus protected. So they're able to calibrate into that school environment. Whereas when you look at the Eidos tribe, there's far less of that influence. It's more individuals are forced to being calibrated to the immediate surrounding, which is the immediate environment they live in. It's one thing to be able to survive in Southeast, for example, and another thing to be able to survive downtown in Georgetown. You know, there's a lot of overlap that's going on there, but you've got to have that baked into the culture. And numerically speaking, most people are going to be calibrated to exist in Southeast and only that. And that's where we get stuck. You know, I could say the same thing for Baltimore. And that becomes very uncomfortable because these are conversations that have traditionally been used against us, especially when we get into the conversation with eugenics, which is, you know, validating differences in people by virtue of race and this belief of a superior genetic breed, etc. I think epigenetics thoroughly debunks that. But if we don't understand that our environment is the tool we can use and should be using to create the end results we want, and that begins with child rearing from ground one, day one, and being responsible with those who are having kids, because we understand that we pass these things on to our kids. We're literally becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy in a lot of these things. And that was probably some of the things that got brought up in the conference that you had in DC, you know, with regards to upbringing and the outcomes that happen with the children, unfortunately.
Yeah, so Nameless, I have a couple of things to say regarding what you just said. And again, I as you've described, much of this is uncomfortable to talk about, and we almost have to be careful in which circles we talk about this in. Mm-hmm. As I was driving back to my place earlier, I was listening to BGS's upload about the Village Wives.
Right.
Please like the video, folks, as BG has said.
Yeah.
And also, if you want to make a donation, the Cash App is there. But you, and also shout out to the field master, Ron Wills. In one of his videos I watched over a year ago, he stated that, especially under today's climate, the women choose whose genes go into the future.
Exactly.
Especially with the huge element of choice that women now have. Since you mentioned the Ados tribe, it seems like we've lost, I don't want to say we, but a significant portion of that tribe has lost the appreciation and the understanding for what role the environment will play in the creation of those next generations.
You know, this is where we get uncomfortable. So I'll go ahead and put on, my misogynist warning cap. Okay. I'm about to go there.
Okay.
So if we understand what went down on these baby farms, and we understand that there has been a psychologically imprinted understanding on the plantation, women could get their emancipation by having children. When we take a look again in aggregate of what's going on in the environment we have now, where men's role in the environment has been greatly made redundant, essentially, by technology and the advancements of government and government presence by the state, it begins to emulate that condition on the plantation. And one of the things we talked about with epigenetics, it isn't just that these behaviors are things that have to be negatives, explicitly. They can even be behavioral patterns and dispositions. This is how you get, for example, dogs through artificial selection, able to be selected for particular behavioral patterns. They're not being selected because the behavior is, a negative. They're being selected because the behavior is preferential. So the different breeds would have different dispositions because they were intended to fulfill different roles. When you look at the definition of artificial selection, what it is by definition verbatim, and understanding from a biological standpoint that when you can control the environment artificially, when you can control who breeds and who doesn't, you get the exact same scenario that was taking place on these baby farms on the plantation. And you now have an artificially selected behavior. That is domestication. Do you know how uncomfortable that is, having that conversation with people? To describe this as domestication. I don't know any other way of saying it. We've done it with plants. We've done it with animals. There is no real difference in DNA between the dog and the wolf. What changes is the epigenetic expression of it. And we can control down to certain behavioral preferential ideologies. We want this dog because it has a temperament to handle herding. We want this dog because it has a temperamental to guarding things preferentially. One we want because we've geared it to have a better form of smell and fine tune it to behave X, Y, and Z. Like, these are things that can be conditioned into the DNA to create domesticated breeds. And when you look at the behavior is emulating the same bred in expectation that was adopted to the plantation. And if you understand that culture has a way of playing itself out, not just with you in the immediate, but it can carry on to other generations, as we proved earlier, it's possible that this could be a thing that's a recurring theme for a very long time, especially when you meet the prerequisite of having the genetic predisposition followed by an environment that facilitates it. You get the expression. Just like folks that have a predisposition for certain mental disorders, if you've got the genetic predisposition, then you've got the physical experience that triggers it. There you go. I think that's really where we're at with a lot of this. And it becomes very uncomfortable because when you get into what do you do about it, a lot of this becomes a a question of how do you reintroduce the role of men to serve as a restabilizing force when men are an option in this modern era? I don't think you can superimpose that without a willingness to let go of the reins, so to speak. And then we're back to that fear condition response. There's so much of social dominance that plays a role in this at this point. I don't want to digress too much, but I'm seeing a little bit of a interdisciplinary conversation with that, and a intersectional conversation with social order and a conditioned expectation with, you know, the ADOS tribe men in general. And I think a lot of that got highlighted with the Moynihan report and the tendency for the ADOS tribe to behave in a matriarchal fashion. And with the introduction of the state propping it up, a gynocratic or a gynocracy, essentially. Like, this is where you get a lot of the foundational basis for it and a scientific explanation for, or a possible explanation for why it continues this way and why it seems to disappear when, or not express itself as openly, when other groups of women are introduced or Black men are put in another environment outside of the United States.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I mean, we are in this discussion, we are kind of blending science and culture. So as you were talking, I was thinking about how the culture has changed. You know, it's clearly, at least in the United States, it's clearly a much different society than it was even 20 years ago. And choosing mates and choosing who was going to reproduce, it was definitely handled across the board with more care years ago. Families didn't want to interbreed with other families, and fathers certainly had more say over who their daughters created families with. And now it just seems like a free-for-all. And certain things, when you're talking, I was thinking about, and I haven't looked at the data myself, but certainly it's been discussed in the sphere, the number of younger men who are still virgins.
Oh yeah, that's much higher.
So I guess what I'm saying is, when you leave everything, when you leave us to our most primal instincts, some people are going to get chosen and some people are not.
I think that's interesting, because this is where maybe me and BGS digress a bit on this point.
Mm-hmm.
This is where I think the Pareto principle kicks in, or the so-called 80-20.
Okay.
Where, and I don't want to use this the way it's used popularly throughout the stream. What I want to say is, I think culture played a role in providing for the old school family structures, models that were relevant to surviving the environment. And we have to remember that we had a unique history here in a country that just so happened to be a superpower. And I don't think we would have gotten the unique conditions of the plantation the way we did with the ADOS tribe if any one of those things weren't true. I don't think this could have been maintained in third world country, because the environment would have been too challenging to be able to just disregard the role of men in general, irrespective of where we were relative to the people who had us enslaved. Case in point, a lot of things you see in the Caribbean or in South America, for example, because you still had that situation in Brazil, you know, with the quilombos and all of that. They still had that same scenario, but it's not being played out the same way it is here in the United States. So if we understand that technology serves as a fuel for civilization, and historically civilization and culture had kind of a sound wave relationship, where you've got the sound event and then you've got the action that caused it, and they don't necessarily happen at the same time. So in the instance of a bullet, the bullet is already taken action. That's the civilization, right? But the sound is the culture. It takes time for that sound to catch up to what the action just was in general. Whereas historically, there wasn't that long of a gap. They seemingly happened at the same time. If this introduced, then there was a change in the culture. And within, that generation or the next, adjustments were made to account for that. But as we said before, technology and culture is changing civilization is changing so quickly that the culture doesn't have time to adjust. So we're still stuck on lag mode and not understanding how huge the industrial revolution was and taking people off of an agricultural based society and putting them in factories. We're still recovering from that. And we're already moving on to an information based dynamic where the social network isn't even with the family anymore. It's online through social media, which will soon be experienced wirelessly through, neurological implants and whatnot. I don't know how the culture plays catch up with that. So if we know we've got this lag time and people want to default to their earliest form of programming, which is, whatever is available to you, and there's no immediate repercussions for that, and there's a lot of positive reinforcement. For example, having kids on the plantation could net you emancipation. Having kids now can net you benefits from the government, especially recently with the child tax laws that went into effect with Biden. People are getting money per month just for having a kid. And I don't want to really put this on blast and make this a assault on welfare or state supported programs, but men aren't doing this. There isn't a pattern of men doing that, especially in the ADOS tribe. And what it ends up doing is it subconsciously kind of recreates that incentive all over again. So here we are, who got to procreate on the plantation? A very specific group of black men, period. And they were the same group of black men that were getting everyone impregnated. Essentially, it was the stud system. And I don't know how, maybe on a greater level this is happening in the modern world when female liberation was just put forward. But I know with the ADOS tribe in particular, this memory isn't going to go away just because time passed. And I don't know how to look at a lot of areas we live at, like the projects and neighborhoods we live in. I don't see how they don't end up being microcosms of that particular environment, which explains why so many of us are trying to flock out of there. You know what I'm saying? And the individuals who would be more fit to push the society forward and be able to compete with other groups of men, historically were seen as threats, not only by our own in-group, but by the society at large. We have to remember that for the overwhelming majority of time in this country, it was illegal for ADOS men to even read, in particular, especially, I would say. It's only been in the last 100 or so years it's even been legal for us to read. I don't think there's a precedence for people to even be comfortable with us being at a particular level of education, let alone have that respected and then aggregate that to actually affect change and maintain control of our immediate environment, which I think leads us to a lot of the problems we experience now. In other words, we have the responsibility, but we don't have the authority. And I think a lot of that may even be not just baked into the culture, but at this point, it may be epigenetic, a conditioned response at this point that's been passed down through heredity.
Mm-hmm. Well, going back to culture and politics, I mean, these stats might have been, might be referenced to death at this point, but I think they're significant. The blackdemographics.com has a very nice graph showing the rate at which black men and black women were married, and then in the early 70s, the divorce rate started to spike. Clearly, government policy had something to do with that.
Mm-hmm.
And the number of fathers around and the ability for the father to stay around, clearly that had something to do with that. So that was something ushered in by an external source.
Right.
Nameless. So this you sent me two. Do you want to say something about this? Then I want to ask you about transhumanism, because I've heard you talk about that before. Was there anything in this particular article that stood out to you? Because I read this one. I started reading the other one. It's titled "Humans Are Evolving Faster Than Ever. The Reason Is Not Genetic Study Claims." So this is basically arguing for culture again, right?
Yes. And it's just part of what we were talking about, all day, where because there's a lag in how fast the civilization changes versus how quickly the culture can respond. This is opening the door to say that most of what people are adapting to doesn't even have anything to do with the current environment anymore. The culture is essentially trying to play catch up and calibrate. And because the traditional mechanisms like family structure aren't in place the way they used to be, people are relying on other social networks. For example, you've got the situation where the kids growing up now, they're learning how to use their iPads and smartphones before they're even learning how to talk. So they're getting access to the internet and information and stimulus, which goes back to what we said about child development, where it's calibrating to its immediate environment because there's not enough gestation time or size of the brain to facilitate too much information being pre-written, much like, other animals do, like horses. They come out the box with, a lot of things that they need to know. But for human beings, they need to be acclimated to the environment. This is really demonstrating that lag between where the civilization is at and how far behind the culture is in playing catch up. And what's really happening is the culture is sort of homogenizing. And it's why I think and this is what ties into, transhumanism. We are behaving more and more like a hive colony. And the society is really calibrating people towards very certain or rather it's de-emphasizing reproduction and re-emphasizing specialization. And it's designating reproduction to a very specific segment of the population to do. And with the advent of things like artificial wombs and whatnot, and being able to genetically modify people to better perform certain tasks, this is the natural trajectory we're heading towards. Where instead of communicating with pheromones and whatnot, we're communicating with the internet connection and social media. They can track trends. They can create demographics. That's what I'm looking for. They can have whole targeted demographics of, information to gear people to work a certain type of way. And this is precisely the way a colony works. It just seems like this is the way human beings are beginning to organize themselves, which does fit the category of culture. But I think this again is a phenomenon of there being a lag from the culture and the civilization outpacing the culture so aggressively.
Okay, so transhumanism, that refers to where do you're changing?
So when I talk about transhumanism, I just mean because we spoke about this with Dr. Nicole Ali when I brought up, the 4 pillars. When we got into, microbiology, the nanotechnology, the neurological sciences, and AI. So these things have been replacing the traditional role of family. Human beings have been culturally calibrated to have family as the initial support mechanism to get they are the incubator, the yolk to the egg, so to speak, so that they can deal with the shell that's called society. So if your culture is adapting to a point where you're not getting it from your mother and father, you're getting it from online sources like the state. For example, look at the Zooming education that's going on right now, where a lot of the education is going to be happening through proxy. You won't necessarily have to walk into a classroom. A lot of your exposure to human etiquette and human interaction is going to be formed on, having voice chats and voice calls. Now they're working on the neurological implants, for example, and you're going to be able to have conversations using your mind. Like, these are things that our genome is going to have to adapt to. That's going to produce epigenetic changes. But in the field of transhumanism, this is a form of progression that is fitting this idea of self-directed evolution. So when you begin to do this and you stop and take a step back and take a look at, for example, an ant colony, it's exactly what an ant colony does. You've got a specific segment of the population responsible for reproduction. You've got particular groups of ants that are designed to perform very specific specialized tasks at the expense of their reproduction.
Wow.
You've got whole structures that are able to be formed, whole neural networks of connection that are done through pheromones, in other words, scent. And they're able to operate in a systemized fashion through generations. This is precisely the way hives work. Bees work this way. Any colonizing insect behaves in this exact same way. And when you take a step back and look at these changes that transhumanism is introducing, this is the natural direction things are going.
So in other words, you have, it might've been you who I heard mention this over on the Roger Report. So you have drones and you have workers, right?
Right.
And the drones are the ones who reproduce.
Yes. Yes. And even amongst them, there's subclasses. You know, they've got subclasses within subclasses. Some of the drones, they serve as, you know, a guard for the queen. Some of them serve as you know, reproductive donors. There are other, you know, workers that can double over into other subclasses that form soldier classes. There's some that can fly. There's some that go out and invade other colonies. There's a lot. I mean, they all have specialized roles, and they do so at the expense of reproduction. So when you look at what the inevitable consequence of a lot of these technologies will have down the line, when you have a longer life expectancy, because now, you know, you can make adjustments to the human genome to address aging. And that was one of the things we talked about on that, putting a less of an emphasis on needing to have so many kids. Then you can actually decide, you know, if you have a kid without needing to go to anybody but yourself in your own discretion, because now you can essentially clone yourself, or you've got an available bay of donors that you can go to that, you know, you just enter this in and it goes through an incubation and boom, you've got a kid. Like, this is not science fiction anymore. These are things that are already being done in theory and behind closed doors, and will probably become mainstream by the next 50, really the next 30 years, but definitely by the next 50 years. I mean, when we look at what can happen in the span of 50 years, you know, go take a look at the 70s, right? Like, from the 70s to now, that same amount of time that's passed, you can have human beings having children and not needing another human being to do it. How does the culture catch up to that? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And that's just one thing. That's not even getting into what will be going on with the internet and social media. Like, you won't be educating your kids in the next 10 to 15 years unless you really go out of your way to. There will be education provided for them by the state. And it will be a point we will see this, where a lot of this information can be experienced in their own minds, uploaded on a regular basis. And it will be a contest between whose kids can afford the technology to get that and who can't.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an example of, you know, equilibrium, because when technology enters the scene, the first side of humanity to be affected were the men. Now, with this backswing in technology in the fourth industrial wave, I think women are finally going to experience that same level of equilibrium. And I don't think the culture is ready for that. I don't think any culture is ready for it, but you can definitely tell by the current trajectory, folks are not ready for that. And it's hard for me to not bring up transhumanism from a baseline scientific perspective when we talk about this, because this is another illustration of epigenetics, or your genes are going to have adjustments to this. This is going to have biological ramifications. And at this point, it's kind of, I won't say preached, it's understood as a form of self-directed evolution. And that's a concept that I'm going to say cultures that have a response to this are going to fare better in the future than those who don't. Because I think there's going to be two different approaches to this in general. A cultural lens will be applied to a lot of these technologies for some groups of people, and there are going to be other groups of people who are going to be totally subject to a lot of this and be the ground zero guinea pigs for a lot of this stuff. And unfortunately, I see our demographic is fitting in the latter group.
Okay. So Nameless, I'm going to ask you something else. I see some of the our familiar faces are in the chat. Appreciate you guys being here. So you said, and I'll throw the link in so some folks can come up and give their reaction as well. So you said, and I'll probably be thinking about this all evening and ideas around in my mind. Okay, that's what he meant. That's what he meant. But when you said in the fourth industrial wave, the women will be adversely affected, are you talking about through automation, or are you talking about through the artificial womb technology, or
everything, the entire dynamic? Because it's effectively going to end gender.
Wow.
It will effectively end gender as the culture is prepared to identify it as. Now, is that going to end people's biological predispositions towards being a particular gender? I don't think so. No, absolutely not. But when we talk about the social ramifications of this, I think we're going to be met with the mouse utopia potential. And if you remember, I think, goodness, maybe we did two. I think we did one or two. Me and Dr. Nicole Ali went over the mouse utopia experiments. And I really think the hive model is the answer to the inevitable result of what you get from the mouse utopia experiments. And it's how you solve the gender issue, the disgendering that's taking place as a result of transhumanism. And let me say that more carefully. A de-emphasis of traditional gender-based roles in a social environment as it's understood by the culture currently. That's how I want to word and articulate that. But there's a lot of ways to misunderstand what I'm saying. I don't think it's necessarily an agenda to be like, oh, we're getting rid of gender. I think this is just an inevitable question that has to be responded by the culture and not by the state. The people have to decide, are they going to continue these roles when options outside of the traditional norm are available? In other words, you get somebody who's well off into their 30s. They're looking at the current environment and they're not satisfied with the potential of having a wife, but they still want offspring. They want children. Well, now they can go and literally essentially go to the lab and get their child created like a custom player in NFL, or the NBA games, Madden or something. You sit down and you tell them what you want. You give them a genetic predisposition. Here's your genes. Here's what you want. Do you want it to be male or female? They can determine that. Do you want particular phenotypes on this child? They can determine that. Do you want a particular advantageous expression of this gene? They can use CRISPR and do that. Like, all that's stopping a lot of these technologies right now is the political sphere, which is really rooted in culture. It's just a proxy for culture. It's an expression of power from a particular culture. But that's the only thing that's stopping that. And overwhelmingly, when you look at the current meta, when you look at overall what's happening in these countries now, where there's a population deficit going on, where there's a race for resources in Antarctica, in other celestial bodies like the moon and Mars and the asteroid belt, there's going to be a push for these technologies to be brought online so that they can compete with other groups of people globally so that they can get the leg up. Immigration isn't plugging that in. People aren't having enough children as it is, contrary to what people understand. And this is serving as a logical solution. So a lot of this is going to be a race on which government gets behind this first. And that's why I don't see this as an if scenario, but it's kind of inevitable. Yeah.
Well, I was just thinking as you were talking that would solve the current quagmire of this standoff between the genders, and it would allow for more babies to be born. I mean, if men and women don't have to agree and voluntarily partner up, and you can just go and have a child if you want one.
But you see how this looks very hive-like, and it's totally alien in the current cultural paradigm in general. Like, the culture doesn't have an answer for anything like that right now. You see what I mean?
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're at an hour and 25 minutes. We'll go a little bit longer. Nameless, before I throw the link in the chat and let some other folks come up and react to anything we've talked about, is there anything else you want to
say? In general, what I really want people to walk away from is epigenetics is not something that's like eugenics, where it's this idea that you're doomed because of your genetic predisposition. A predisposition is like a perspective. You are acclimated to one, and a lot of your worldview will be predicated on it. But as human beings, we are designed to adapt to our environment, even after we've been set on a particular trajectory. So this is not a death sentence, but what determines your outcomes is your awareness and your ability to apply discipline to change that trajectory should you desire to. And in understanding epigenetics and understanding that you as a human being with agency can influence your environment and then in turn affect your own genetic expression is a profound power that I think is encouraging and has provided a lot of positive influence, I can say, in my life and those individuals that I've got the privilege of being around as well to share this information. A little story, when I first learned about epigenetics, it was during, a period where I was gathering a lot of information, and I came across this conversation as far as it is concerned with intelligence, because as a lot of people understand, intelligence is thought to be primarily written in the DNA, essentially. A lot of it is greatly influenced by your genetic predisposition for it. But whether or not that potential gets expressed is a matter of epigenetics. In other words, your environment. And if you're in the correct environment, even if you've got a genetic predisposition for intelligence, you won't necessarily express it unless the environment helps to allot and cultivate that for you. And there was a coworker I had, an individual I was working with when I was still in the Northern Virginia area. This man was 50 years old. I just happened to have a conversation. I said, did you know that they learned that intelligence has so much more to do with the environment that you're born into and not so much on your DNA? And when I said this 50-year-old grown man, stand-up man, was in tears when I said that. Caught me off guard. He was in tears, and he looked at me, he said, thank you for telling me that. And the weight of that hit me so heavy, because I think a lot of us as a demographic have been affected by a lot of these ideas that eugenics wants to put forward, that simply because we were born with a certain skin pigment, that we are predetermined and have a predisposition to be this taint on the planet, that we're inferior by virtue of what we are. That simply isn't true. That man lived 50 years, 3 sons, upstanding, had no idea, living with that weight. And just from having that understanding that he was never doomed just because of what he was born as, triggered that strong of a response in him. And ever since I saw him, passed after that, his whole demeanor was even brighter than what I recognized him for. And it makes me question how many of us are walking around thinking that just because of what we are on a genetic level, the way you manifested, what phenotypes you have, how many people think that's a death sentence? It's not. You have control over what you express by controlling your environment. If you change your environment, you change you. That is the walkaway, the takeaway I want people to have with epigenetics, and why we need to really be involved with this, because frankly speaking, this is a ticket to changing everything. In other words, this is our solution. Either on an individual level, you can take advantage of it, or preferentially, we can start doing this on a collective level and take the initiative to decide whether or not we want to have a community, because that's a way we can insulate ourselves for this and have it work for the better rather than work against us.
Okay. Well, everyone, I'm going to throw the link in the chat momentarily so folks can come and give reaction to anything me and Nameless talked about. But I want to reiterate something here that this is my thinking man here. If I can find a black one, I'll find a black one. But my channels are about thinking. And so there's nothing that me and Nameless talked about or said today that was, we acknowledge that there are difficult parts of this conversation, but we didn't talk about anything here to demonize anyone or any particular group. And that's important because there are people who have never heard of this and the people who have never thought about this. And so it can be uncomfortable to think of the ramifications of some of these things for the people who haven't heard of this stuff before. Now, the other thing I'm going to say, over on the Roger Report, I have jokingly discussed my one of my former an ex, and I jokingly and affectionately call her my strong-minded independent queen from Northwest Miami. And one of the things that I remember about that is that that actually came up. You know, our backgrounds. Some of us stay stuck in our backgrounds. That's what I'm trying to say, and where we come from. And there are people who say, well, you know, this is where I'm from, so this is how I am, and this is how I'm always going to be. You can't change this. I can't change this. Don't try to change this about me. But it sounds like, and we went back and forth about that. I mean, not just her, but with other people, you see that. But it sounds like, Nameless, you're a believer in the fact that we can change, and we can alter trajectories, and things are not static, they're fluid.
Exactly. And it's important to understand the responsibility you have for the baggage you do carry. So I'm going to say both. Where you come from matters, but it only matters insofar as to what you do in your environment that helps put you in the direction that you actually want to go. We have the agency to do that in the present moment. We have no way of changing what's happened to us, but we can decide what we do about it. And knowing that we have a pathway to affect change that expresses itself on all levels of our biological expression, that's good news to me, because the narrative I heard is once you manifest on the physical realm, that's it. That's all you can do. You're subject to your upbringing. You're subject to who your parents were. And to a degree, that is very true. But that's not the only part of it. You also have the ability with the knowledge, which is why culture is so important, because it's supposed to serve as a repository for this information, that you can affect change on your persona and on your environment by addressing the environment. And epigenetics is just a biological receipt as to how we can make that happen on all levels, including what you eat and the way you live. And a word that I use to describe that in a nutshell is discipline.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, everyone, Rael is here. And so again, everyone, the overarching question for this stream was how do culture and environment impact the actual biology? So just keep that in mind. And we didn't even spend time on food deserts, and that's a whole hours-long discussion in itself.
You know, maybe we can come back and do another one talking about food in particular, because I think that'd be a great opportunity to introduce the gut biome, since that's related to epigenetics, but probably needs to have its own conversation, because we are greatly affected by that. I'm a vegan, so there's a lot I can talk about as far as that goes, especially for what I'm learning now. But
yeah, and for those who don't know, food deserts, there are communities where they don't have quality food. They don't have quality supermarkets. They have fast food. They have corner stores, but they don't have quality food. So those people, as you would expect, have health dispositions that would go along with that lack of quality food. So I'm going to pass the mic to Rael. Rael, welcome.
Peace, Dr. Dunbar. Peace, Nameless. Karina as well. This is a very interesting conversation. I referenced a book on Roger's channel called The Clarity Cleanse. It was written by an MD, and what he found out in his practice that he said without fail, whenever somebody came to him with a sickness, he was always able to trace the illness to some psychological issue that they were having, that they had been, repressing. He was saying how these psychological issues obviously contributed to their physical sickness. And so what's interesting about this conversation is when you brought up the idea about, people, the future of education in terms of being tailored towards people with money getting a certain level of education. In my master's program, when I was in it, we actually talked about this in the future, how the future of public funding is going to actually be decreased. There are going to be people who, because they have the resources, they're going to actually design curriculums for people with money so that their children can actually start getting the ball rolling early in some of this more innovative style of education. So it's going to be based on who can afford it. This is obviously for people who can't afford it, it's going to be a problem for them. And obviously, with Black people's situation economically, collectively, it's not going to bode too well for them. But I think we have to keep in mind too, negative environments doesn't necessarily mean that their genetic failure will ultimately happen. Booker T. Washington came from one of the worst environments you can come from, literally the plantation, and he built Tuskegee. Booker T. Washington was actually one of the people who fought back against Darwin's notion of survival of the fittest, because he based it off of the actual experience of Black people on the plantation. He said, well, based on our experience from the plantation, we're the most fit. So the problem, I think, in this particular situation is it's one thing when you have laws that keep you from being able to read, and that's a real thing. But it's a whole different ballgame when the group of people that you come from impose this lack of curiosity and learning on you. And when you have that intellectual curiosity, instead of developing that intellectual curiosity, people attribute it to it being some white shit. And I mean, I've said this many times, even in Roger's channel, speaking specifically to the men, you're going to have to read. I mean, there's just no way you can be in an information innovation age and not read. This is where the material is synthesized so you can conceptualize whatever the book is talking about. So and the thing about reading too is reading is a form of meditation too. So you need that space where you could just sit back and be in solitude and just be one with the knowledge. And so we've seen in this particular space for at least 2 or 3 years, we had a knockdown knuckle fest about the so-called lames, educated lames, and the Pookies. That within itself shows that Black America really does have a problem collectively with the idea of intellectual curiosity stimulation, which allows a group to actually progress. We know this because post the 60s, we had a group that was moving towards that trajectory. We had multiple people in our group that were moving the group towards that particular aim. And then the 60s came and it just came to a halt. So it's not like post-slavery, we didn't have that capacity. That would be a lie. I mean, we literally have an ex-slave who built a school, which is the quintessential act of wanting to see the people in the group advance and use their brain capacity to advance the group. The problem is that once the 60s roll around, and you just really have a halt to that mindset. And to me, I think that I would say that this is probably the most defining issue, because this is not even a white issue. One of the scientists who was, I forget his name. He's a theoretical physicist. I can't think of his name, Fukushima or something like that. He said that without the H-1B1 visa, he said America would have been collapsed.
Was that Uchiyo Kakyo?
He kind of has the grayish hair. His hair is kind of long.
Yeah, and he speaks. He's Japanese American, right?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, that's Machio Kakyo.
Okay, so he said that America would have been collapsed without the H-1B1 visa because there was a lot of things politically that was being talked about, bandied about should it be ended and stuff like that. Well, he was saying that without the H-1B1 visa, he said America would have collapsed. He wasn't saying that based off of Black people. He was saying that about the whole of America. And he was saying that this allowed certain types of people to be brought in the country to help with the intellectual aspect in terms of from the technological standpoint. So we have really, because again, if you look at the numbers, the numbers of the engineers that China puts out a year, the amount of engineers that India puts out a year, is vastly underrepresented as it relates to America, which is a problem because America is a first world country. But when you look at the educational standing of America collectively, I think America may be like 18th or something like that, which is ridiculous because America should easily be top 5 being a wealthy particular country. And you have people who have tried to address these issues. One of the founders from Home Depot actually donated, him and his wife, I think, donated like $300 million to NYU for the medical school program, because the shortage of doctors in America is really, if it doesn't get addressed, it's going to be an issue in the future, because there are a lot of people who are just not willing to put in that work to get to that level. So, we have some really serious things that we have to address, especially from our own group perspective, from that vantage point. We have a lot of people who just really hate information. And I think it's on a psychological level, because that cognitive dissonance, when you get something that completely is diametrically opposed to what you believe, it's very hard for the human to really accept that. And that's just an individual basis thing. That's not a race thing. That's just a human thing. Are you really prepared to hear something different that completely obliterates something you believe in? And unfortunately, right now, our group is more belief than actually knowing.
Well, I'll respond a little bit to that so we can get to the next person too. But I think this is really covered very well with what we spoke about earlier on conditioned responses and how those conditioned responses can literally be inherited. And I made the point earlier about how the overwhelming majority of this country's history, you know, it was illegal for us to even read in the first place. That wasn't to excuse it currently, but it was to describe the cultural inertia that exists today as to why there's such a negative disposition of men in the Ados tribe demonstrating intelligence and putting it to work to actually build. There is a legitimate inbred fear. And I think there's a lot of that that's cultural. There's a lot of that that is anecdotal. And I can tell you now, even growing up, you know, I would hear things like, you're smart for a black kid, like from my teachers and stuff like that. You know, one of the first things they tried to do was put me in what do they call those classes? I don't want to call them remedial. Special education.
It's called remedial.
Yeah. Well, they tried to put me in those classes, and then they put me into the testing for it, and you know, they ended up placing me in advanced placement programs and the Signet program. You probably know about the Signet program, Dr. Anwar. Yeah, I ended up testing 97 percentile. So like out the gate, they have an idea about us in general that's baked into the culture. And most of us have to operate from a position of that's where we're perceived at. Now we need to work against that. So we'll have individuals like we identified earlier that will become exceptions. But unlike other communities, they're not succeeding because of that. They're succeeding in spite of that. It just so happens that in the modern era now, most people who stay in the United States for a while, if they're not riding on old money, they're also not aspiring to those positions either. So they've had to outsource that from other groups of people who are coming from that inertia to come over here and build. And that's leading to a lot of the current environment, how you get the Asian demographic overrepresented in a lot of these capstone places. But one thing I'll say about their culture as well, and I'll say this about a lot of folks that are on the continent also, titles mean something in their cultures because they were keys to moving up in their class system. And here we have a different way we organize and designate a lot of that here. Most of it is predicated on your phenotype, especially in group when you have that conversation. We just so happen to be at the bottom of that, given our classification as Black. And this is where we run into, this is why I prefer to have the conversation not so much about race, but of social dominance order, because there's no reason why we can't be our own in-group, as I said before, to attain that power. But we've got to understand the actual playing field first. But unfortunately, like a certain someone said, we deal with the dreams. You know, we talk about the dreams we have. We don't focus on the reality of the situation, because it really means a reallocation of not just the responsibility, but of the authority. And if you don't have individuals that are conditioned to understand what that authority looks like, and the authority figures are individuals other than you, you can't expect to successfully take responsibility for something because you don't have the authority to even carry it out if you wanted to. You have no choice but to operate as an island like the overwhelming majority of us have to do if we employ that word discipline. So I completely agree with you, Rael. I think, again, talking about epigenetics is important because it demonstrates the responsibility a group of people has to its future generation. And it shows that if you don't make those corrections, which I believe discipline is the key to addressing your epigenome, discipline can be applied to yourself, which is a form of environment, and your immediate environment can be applied through discipline. That's called lifestyle. That's how you get the end results you're looking for, because even Booker T had to employ that word to a tremendous degree. And that's probably one word that really defines who he was and a lot of generation of men that came from his era.
I disagree. I agree and I disagree.
Well, hold on. Last Zulu. Let's let Kareem. She was
she was next.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Nameless, Oos, Dr. Umbar, Dr. Dunbar, Rael, and last Zulu. I always could get confused by your name. I have a question. I just wanted to, I don't know if you addressed this already because I'm in and out of the chat. And
well, can you speak up a little? Can you speak up a little bit louder? I can hardly hear you.
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's a little bit better.
Okay, sorry. I'm in an old apartment, so the Wi-Fi is not that great. So my question was about the gene editing, and I think it's Cipher is the technology. It's pronounced Cipher, Spicer. I don't know the exact word, but how does
CRISPR.
it CRISPR? Yes. How does it affect the epigenetics? Is that do we know anything about that affecting it, or?
Well, okay. So what Cas9 is, it's a molecule that was discovered in a bacteria, which is able to essentially emulate and copy a genetic sequence and then integrate it into another without destroying it. So they managed to find a way to take that Cas9 or CRISPR molecule and apply it to other purposes. So they can program it in an isolated environment to copy a particular sequence, and then they can tell or identify that molecule to go into another sequence that's already created and essentially copy and paste it, implant a completely different set of structures. And the end result, is who knows what, right? But because they've mapped out the genome for so many different things, humans included, they are able to make adjustments like this. And that's why the term gene editing is there. When I brought up Cas9 in the future, I was talking about scenarios where people would be able to do this to human beings. This has already happened. Illustration you can Google, and I can get you an article if you want, are the Lulu and the Lala twins, who were born just before the COVID situation popped off. They were born with a genetically edited predisposition to resist the AIDS virus. And I think they're about 2 years old now. So this is already happening. And what that has effectively done is introduce the idea of not only can you change the way a gene is expressed, because I'll use another analogy to compare so you understand the significance of this. Imagine being a playwright and you write your play. That's your genetic code. Once that script is written, no changes really occur unless there's some kind of crazy misprint. That's what a mutation is. Those are they're common, but they're rare in that they're not usually significant enough to, have these crazy adverse effects where you're no longer, normal or something. But what does change and what does matter are the actors that are playing the playwright. In other words, the way the play is expressed is the same way the gene is expressed, and the actors are the epigenetics. So if you have the ability to change and edit the script, and you can, by manipulating the environment, change the environment, you have complete self-directed evolution at that point. And that was the point I was making about into the future, a lot of the social ramifications that have to be dealt with when human beings basically gain that kind of authority. That's intruding on realms that traditionally have been reserved for religion, and culture is an aspect of that. And folks going to have to make some decisions on what that looks like, because in the immediate family model, this changes a lot of things, especially like your phenotypes. If you've got the ability to decide whether or not your children have phenotypes that are traditionally associated with being Black, you can make that decision if you want to. And there's, who are you to say to or not to? That's going to be decided by the culture, is what I'm saying. So these are questions that a lot of people, I don't think they consider. And I don't think they are aware how fast people are going to have to make these decisions in the very near future, because a lot of these things are going to be determining whether or not those children can even compete with other groups of children who decide to get these changes.
Well, didn't I think Tiana, if I'm not mistaken, didn't she have the surgery to change her eye color to blue? I think she did.
No, not necessarily. What she did, she got laser, some kind of new laser-ish surgery when they just basically put a lens between your eye. And this is, I think, is what your cornea and one of the other specific eyes. I'm not sure on the part specifically, but she basically got a lens put in between her eyes that gives the reflexive the color. That's all she did. She didn't genetically change her eyes or anything.
Yeah, I didn't think anybody's done that.
Hey guys, I'm just going to show this real quick for Corinne. Corinne, I think this is also a strategy they're using for cancer right now. I used this when Nicole first came to my channel. So the Cas9, it could take this sequence that it wants to put in, and then you have this target DNA here that you want to basically replace. And so it puts in the sequence that it puts a desired sequence in for a sequence you want to remove, basically.
Yep, lets you break the rule.
Well, actually, according to Tiny, she wanted to do something different when she traveled to Africa for a procedure that permanently changed her eye color from brown to light gray.
It's not permanent. It's not well it's permanent as in necessarily it can stay in your eye for until you basically die, but it's not permanent because she can have it removed and put in at will.
Yeah, like if you get an epigenetic, a genetic editing to have that, like that would be something you could pass on to your kids potentially.
Basically.
Yeah, that's the difference there.
Okay.
So that's why the term self-directed evolution was important. Go ahead, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I just wanted to pass it to Last Zulu.
Yeah, basically, I understood basically, you know, when humans stop playing God for themselves, basically, which is cool. I have no grand issue with that. I actually think that's probably the best thing that you can probably do for each other necessarily, or at least for themselves. But my only thing necessarily where it comes to my counter argument necessarily, what I think was when you said it was to Nameless actually, when you said I think the reason you were going to get yourself out of that was it was going to be discipline, and I don't see discipline being the thing that's going to get you out of that necessarily. I would say you just need money.
Can I clarify that statement?
I understand that you can probably say you need discipline to get money, but it's really just come down to the money.
But let me qualify that statement. I'm not saying that as a means of solving every problem that you have.
Of course.
I mean discipline as the modality to affect your environment, including yourself. So that's a fundamental thing that, generally speaking, operates like the number one in algebra everywhere else. Discipline is understood. You don't even have to say it. But for the context of this conversation, I needed to say that so that people can understand the software they can use to affect that change. Now, what they do once they've acquired that measure of self-mastery and self-control does enter into the realm of power, which I see money. You understand what I'm saying? So I agree with that wholeheartedly. But in order to get to that point, there needs to be a measure of self-discipline instilled. And if we're disproportionately suffering from a lot of these things that can be affected epigenetically, it then falls on us to do the steps to actually make those changes. And I'm all about providing illustrations, examples, and education that you can follow to implement some of these changes for yourself. And it's not as difficult as a lot of people would imagine in the long run, but I think it's a positive thing to make people aware that they're not slaves to their genetics, that there is a measure of control you can assert, and discipline is a useful tool to making that realized.
I do understand that aspect of it necessarily, but my next question would be to the group, and that's to Nameless and then to the panel though. Wouldn't this necessarily be a great thing? Wouldn't this necessarily be a great thing for those who have money? Because all this basically seems to me is like a power move in a grand scheme. If I have the money and the power to necessarily give my child the best chance of survival, I would necessarily, right? And It's basically going to be those who have the power and the finances to put their child in the position to win. Like I put my child my child has more gray matter, so they can learn and understand things faster than your kid. My child basically can move faster and be a grand athlete because my child has better reflexes because the neurons fire out faster. All simple thing necessarily. So basically, it's just as I see it. It's basically the power versus the powerless, and the only reason I can see as I see it necessarily, the only reason issue with black people necessarily, I'm gonna say that much, or I'm gonna say or Ado tribe, as you said it, is just that if you don't have women that you can actually work with or that's actually usable, that can actually do what they need to do, then that either means one or two things have to happen. The men have to find new women to necessarily to be able to build with, to go to that whatever level that they choose to ascend to, and so forth and so on, that, or they just stay with the same woman they have and they end up crashing and burning and become the victims of people who have power.
Well,
So let me
push back because I'm gonna have to go nameless. I'm gonna cut you off. Well, one of the biggest mistakes that Black people make is they automatically assume that having money translates into forward progression. That's wrong. If you know anything about the transference of wealth, you know that over 60% of wealth that's transferred from first generation to the second is actually lost. If you go to the third generation, you're talking about 70%. Why is this the case? Because the people who made the money have a very different mindset from the people who
inherited the money. I understand.
From the people who made the money. So it's a difference between being Warren Buffett and Warren Buffett's child. Now, if you have Warren Buffett's work ethic like he did, then yeah, you can get to that level. So that when you understand these particular scenarios, it shows you that that's a beautiful thing, because it shows you that even with people who have money, discipline is still a part of the equation. You have to be financially disciplined. I have two books that I've referenced in context of this. One is called Kids, Wealth, and Consequences, and the other one is Family Wealth Transition Planning. And both books give you an insight into how people with money think in terms of certain scenarios that they set up for their children to make them conscious of the power of money. So, for example, if they want their children to be more responsible with money, they'll set them up their own trading account, for example. This is giving an example where they will show their children how to actually invest in stocks and stuff like that. Their own money, it will be theirs. And it will be theirs to lose or to increase. And it will give them the experience and the education, the financial education, for them to not be frivolous with money. So they have actual skin in the game. So so basically what he's saying across the board is an actual, it really is true. Most people think it'll be a cliche, but the actual discipline.
Discipline with the knowledge. I understand what he's saying in the grand scheme of like you must have discipline and understanding. I understand that, but basically how as I've seen it. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. Nah, you did say like most people lose that. Like a lot of people who build wealth necessarily their children lose wealth. Because I have family members who had that that it's worth millions. Their kids inherited the money that their parents necessarily got, and they squandered it because the kid necessarily did not learn the proper discipline, or the child did not necessarily get taught necessarily the ways to actually use the money. I understand that concept, but basically as I'm seeing it, and for the quote unquote ADOS tribe, as Nameless has said, the fact is basically this: you either find women who can help you to. Well, not necessarily help you, but necessarily find women who help you to cooperate necessarily, who are cooperative, and let the men build and build finances, and the men must be disciplined because it's the only way you can be disciplined to build money. And those who do will probably be able to survive and put their kids in the best situation to survive, and the other ones who do not will be guinea pigs. Simple. Am I missing anything?
Well, that's why I mentioned the dichotomy, and I said that we're going to have a strategy. There's a lot. There's a lot going on.
We've been joined by VGS.
Yeah, there's a lot. Well, go ahead, Nameless. Go ahead.
So, and I wanted to not necessarily dwell too much on using epigenetics exclusively as a solution tool for our problems in aggregate, but as a metric to demonstrate the need or the biological potentiality of us being influenced by our past genetically, how that can happen and why, how it patterns our framework of interpreting our worldview in this word culture, and what can be done to addressing it. And ultimately, at the end of the day, since we know that women are the gatekeepers to culture, if women in the ADOS tribe don't want it, it's not happening. Which
I thought women were the pastors of culture, not the makers of culture. I'm confused about that.
Okay, culture is made by culture. We always think that men make culture, but culture is actually dictated by the environment. first, okay, because you have to adapt to it. That's like some people can make money in take Warren Buffett, okay, in his environment when he was born and the business environment that he was in, he can make a lot of money, right? His kids may not be able to make the same kind of money because the environment, the way you make money has changed. Okay, that happens all the time with businesses. It happens all the time with a host of other things, right? So can you adapt to the environment that you're in? Okay. And as far as epigenetics, what Nameless is talking about is just one factor. It's not the only factor. It's one factor that we may be missing. How the genes actually express, and can those genes, after they express, can they be passed on? Right. That's just one thing. Okay. Because say if you pass on to a certain sequence, right, a certain expression to your kids, right, and all of a sudden you move that kid to a different environment, basically that gene expression is going to have to go dormant because it's not needed. Okay.
So or it can go the other way around.
Okay, or it can go the other way around. It can be overexpressed. Okay. And but the thing is, epigenetics is the epigenetics culture, what you have been taught, actually making the cultural conditioning and the cultural environment and the physical environment that you're in all work together. There's not just one thing. He's trying. If he included everything, it'd be too much. He's trying to narrow it down to express how this one thing works. And sometimes what we do as Black people, we try to run all over the place instead of focusing in on just one thing. It's actually more complex. But I want to talk to you about what you're talking about as far as CRISPR and that kind of stuff. Okay. That has nothing to do with that bacteria do the exact same thing, right? What is
it from? Correct.
What is any female's function biological function to her offspring?
Give our child the best chance of survival. We know
in the environment, right? So it doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor, because do rich people have an advantage as far as CRISPR? Sure, they will eventually. But the thing is, the problem is what we're talking about is not individuals doing it. We're talking about the state doing it, because once they start manufacturing children, the state's going to step in and they're going to give you the option of whether you want a naturally born child or you want a child that's produced. Okay. Because ultimately that child is going to have to go into as a citizen, as a state. And the more children you make, people that you make of this quality, guess what's going to happen? That's going to advance your society as far as competition with the next society. So they're taking this stuff out of your hands, out of the woman's hands.
And that's why I made mention of the hive dynamic, because it's precisely the way a hive operates, and why I said society would be calibrated to have a de-emphasis on reproduction and more specialized roles in other locations. That's where that was coming from. Yeah.
In fact, that's what they call the singularity, where basically culture was basically a reflection of human biology and environment, right? And as culture has as people have terraformed their not only the environment first, but also now in terraforming their bodies, guess what? Culture is going to dictate the whole thing. In other words, your technological culture is going to drive not only your environment, but also your biology. And when that does that, that's when the singularity will happen, and you're going to actually change at light speed. Because
that's where that term self-directed evolution comes to mind, that I really want people to look up. Yeah,
they have all kinds of terms for it. They call it a singularity when actually culture, where actually the technological culture actually transmit all this stuff, because I actually did a video on this. Basically, your evolutionary biological culture change between, and a doc can correct me if I'm wrong because he's the expert, right? If between 20 and 10,000 years, where you're going to get a biological change in human beings, right? Okay, which used to be the same with your environmental change. Like, if you look at glaciers move like what takes like 10, 15,000 years to move. So your environment would change at the same speed as your biological change, right? And you put those two things together, your culture would actually dictate your culture, until you brought in technology, right? Now you can live in Antarctica, you can live in Saudi Arabia, you can live other places that that normally your body wouldn't be able to live in, because you're terraforming your environment. Okay. And the last piece in this particular singularity is terraforming the actual DNA the actual expression of the genes to where the body can change at the same speed that your environment and your culture change. And that is the last piece. Once you do that, then all three will merge and they can all change exactly at the same time, which is within if you look at your culture in your cultural environment, right? As far as just something as simple as dating, right? Okay, dating apps were really like backwater until the iPhone came about, right? In 14 years, the iPhone and dating apps have changed the way we actually express ourselves as far as dating and mating. In 14 years, all right? Because you change number one, your physical environment with the tools that you use, and then that changed your cultural environment, and that just changed the expression of it. So that shows you how fast this stuff can change. Imagine if you can do that with your bodies.
I have a question for Nameless, though. I just after anybody else speak, I do have my question that I want to speak to Nameless necessarily for.
Yeah, go ahead, Zulu.
Oh, okay. Well, basically, you said in a few years, basically, when you get to that level, when you be able to choose your own genetic path and how you want to live, basically kind of play God to a certain degree. That sections where the people will be basically leveled off into, you do this job, you do that job, kind of like a hive colony. Necessarily, in my twisted brain of mine, then when the state has that kind of power, basically when the state has that kind of power, they can basically designate somebody to be a permanent underclass forever by just genetically modifying you to be that way. Now that's how I'm necessarily looking at this process. That means I have the ability to control.
It's called Brave New World. They wrote it back in the 30s.
Yeah, there's a lot of
actually they already did it. If you go back to the 1920s or 30s, I think there was about 30 states that had like eugenic laws on the books.
Yeah.
Like it's already, I mean, and the funny thing about it was,
keyword is the Watts Institute. That's what I want to say about that. The Watts Institute. But go ahead.
Oh, yeah.
So
Prescott Bush.
But the funny thing about it is that because it was a Supreme Court case with a white girl that actually helped implement it. They were specifically trying to keep poor white women from procreating.
Yep, they call it.
So
why not black people though? I know we're a smaller part of the population, but why not necessarily?
Because they want to perfect their race. That's why.
You know, a good book to read on that, Zulu, and this will be a good book for you to take a look at. It's called White Trash.
Yes,
and it really breaks down everything we're talking about, so you can understand how a lot of this. The class system that was inherited here really started out there in Europe, and it was ported over here.
I understand. Trust me. I've read the book. I'm pretty literate necessarily. I'm not gonna say I'm maybe not me a BGS or Dr. Dunbar, maybe some y'all level, but I'm pretty literate. I read a lot. So I understand they're trying to uplift their own race and whatnot. So I understand the concept of that. Then if that's necessarily the way, then why don't they just necessarily just through some kind of I'm gonna say chemical castration or chemical unfertilization necessarily, just get rid of women that way and just say, "Oops, we did it by mistake."
Because there's more of the rabble than there are of you. Will the rabble stand for it?
Right, and then they still at the end of the day
kill off the other side of the portal.
But they have.
If there's more, in other words, the elite. What percentage do the elite make up?
Probably maybe 10% of the population.
No, 1%, right?
Really? You don't think 10?
No, come on, man. The elite make up less than 1%. The 0.1%.
You mean elite in like finances and elite in
all the elite make up less than 1%. Way less than 1%. Okay. Yep. And thing is, so 99.9% of the people, you have to persuade them to go for it. How do you do that? If you're castrating them.
Well, they actually,
not all of them. I'm like, it's a simple thing. Like I say, well, if you're of this intelligence level, let's say if you can mathematically solve these equations and whatnot, then you are part of the lucky few on some
you probably are, but persuading the peasants to do something is extremely difficult. It takes generations. It doesn't happen overnight. Okay.
Right, and it needs to be consensual, meaning that the people have to agree with it. People have to agree.
Well, they don't necessarily have to be consensual, because there were some stories where school districts had actually gave birth control to black women's daughters.
Right.
It's on a very, very small scale. Okay?
But we're talking about in aggregate to really address the overall conversations we talk about
1 or 2 incidents, but the thing is that's not going to affect the greater majority of the masses.
And I don't want to digress.
I was saying it in the context of what you were saying over time, having something like that happen and seeing what the response was going to be to it.
The easiest way, that's where the CRISPR and genetically modifying the kid is actually going to come in, right? Is that it's going to be just a natural outgrowth, because you're working with how human beings think already, right? You want to have a natural kid and go up and have half the other kids with this advanced technology in them, and they're like 4 times as good as your kid, or you're going to get in with the rest of them.
Right. If you want an example of that, you can just look at the whole X-Men scenario in the Marvel comics. I mean, I don't know any other way to really articulate that in a visual sense, but that's pretty much what we're talking about now, which was the conversation about the civilization outpacing the speed at which the culture can adapt.
Right.
In other words, people's current snapshot of culture is not prepared to deal with these questions in general. We're not.
Look, we talk, even though I don't agree with Nameless about the 80-20 rule, because really it can't exist. And the reason it doesn't exist is because if you have 80% of the men that are frustrated sexually, you're going to have violence, a whole lot of violence in the culture, and you don't have that. You have a whole lot of violence and prostitution in the culture, and we don't see that. So that's like we know that the 80-20 rule is not really in effect, even though they like to claim it. All people would like the top 20% of any group, right? That you prefer it if you can get it, but people settle all the time.
Well, let me caveat that by saying that I didn't want to hard disagree with that. I just want to say that the assumption of that 80-20 and the desire for that 20% has the social ramification and social consequence that we are experiencing, especially when it comes down to who's actually having children. Because we can even look at our demographic and we know it's only like 53% of us even having kids, let alone that. So that's what I was speaking to more so.
Isn't that kind of the 80-20 rule, basically, right?
If you factor in the harsh ramifications of what happens if you have a child out of wedlock in this environment, you got to factor it in, because it wasn't that way before these draconian child support laws actually came in. It wasn't that way.
Right. And what was that? I just had it on the tip of my tongue. You said it before. The child, dang on, it was in the 1800s too. The tender years doctrine. Doctrine.
Well, that part of it, where because we actually talked about that with Gigi. 10 years doctrine actually changed the patriarchy, the hard patriarchy, to a soft patriarchy, and then eventually to a matriarchy. Right. Because the hard patriarchy means that the children belong to the father, right? So you took away the possession of the father and gave it to the mother, and ultimately gave the possession of the children to the state.
Right.
Because right now the children really belong to the state, for the most part.
Which is again leading us back to the conversation that we were having about current future structure of family.
Can you break that down and say when you mean the children belong to the state? I understand what you mean, but can you give me more clarification?
If the
we're having a BGS drift, just so you know.
Okay, all right. I'm sorry. I'll drop down in a minute.
No, you don't gotta drop down. This is cool. I just want to be aware of Dr. Emma's time. That's all.
Okay. Basically, this the Nameless probably read. Did you read Empire Cotton, Nameless?
Yep.
Remember in chapter 7 when the cheap cotton came into Europe and they had trouble getting workers actually work in the textile factories.
Yep.
And so they couldn't really get the men to do it, but so what they took the women first and then the children, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then right after they took the women and the children, put them in the factories, and the men were not happy about it. Basically, they brought in the 10 years doctrine right after that. So basically, they gave control of the child to the mother until 7 years old. Okay, yeah. And then as you advanced, then they gave the control of the child to the mother until the child was 16 years old. Basically, it's in the 19th century, a child is adult at 16. So basically, you've given control of the child to the mother, possession of the child to the mother. Okay, so by the time the child's an adult, the child belongs to himself. So basically, you're turning the patriarchy into a matriarchy. Okay, and then and then once you introduce social welfare and you introduce basically what is it called, compulsory education, blah 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 blah, basically, and take the children out of the workforce and out of the farm and put them into schools. Basically, the wealth of having a child working for you is gone, right? Basically, all the wealth that's gained by the child belongs to the state.
Right.
And so if you do something, as far as child welfare, say you spank a child too hard, even now, okay, say you talk loud to a child, the child feels abused, they can bring in a social worker, take that kid from you, okay,
and it's getting even worse
and make it a reward of the state. Go ahead.
It's getting worse now because you're going to have these children again that are going to be connected to these networks. And we have the whole smart city thing going on. They're going to see the parental figures as their extended network and not the parents. And that's what I was talking about. Yeah. The family roles are being decentralized and essentially made proxy by the state. This has been a gradual process that's happened for a while now, but it's really speeding up now. And COVID, again, put us in a position to where, a lot of that is being emphasized. And that's why I use the illustration of the children learning how to use smartphones and their iPads before even learning how to actually speak linguistically. Yeah. So like this is changing the neurology and getting back to epigenetics. Yeah. The epigenetic expression is adapting to this. It's adapting, calibrating.
And what happens when that's like the little machine that Nicole showed that we're actually making mice, right? You make them 12 at a time. What happens when you bundle it up and put human beings in there? Basically, all they need is a little DNA and reform it, and they can make all the citizens that they need.
And again, you're stuck with having some sort of solution that you got to come up with that's going to be based on the culture that, again, people are not ready for. And, the stratification is going to be inevitable. It's not just going to be stratification. It's going to be hyper stratification.
Yeah, it's going to be singularity level.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that when you see collapsing environments, I mean, what is one of the things that people tend to do? They tend to turn to the state for protection. That's what they do.
Well, they don't have a network
because necessarily the state takes your money. So it's only naturally turn to the state.
What I'm saying is that they're more because we hear people talk a lot, about even people that be on some anti-government type stuff. Mm-hmm. But when shit hit the fan, who do they want the most? They want that government. Yeah. You see it on both sides. You know what I'm saying? Like you saw with the Tea Party people back in the day. They were saying government out my business, but they were on social welfare programs because that's what it is.
What? Really?
Yeah. I mean, yeah. A lot of those Tea Party people were on shit like food stamps and what do you call it? Medicare, Medicaid, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So people. Matter of fact, I remember Melissa Harris Perry when she had a show on MSNBC. I'll never forget when she said this. She literally said that. She said, "Well, y'all have, she said, Black people need to understand that, your child is not your child. Mm-hmm. Your child is ours. Like it's the village's child. Mm-hmm. We have to reconceptualize how we view having children. That child is not yours." Mm-hmm. What she was really saying was, your child is the state's child.
It belongs to the state, yeah. And the state is we think of the state as this nebulous thing that sits out there somewhere. No, the state is you as a collective.
I mean, what? I thought the state was a collection of individuals necessarily the quote unquote do the best for the society.
No.
You mean to doing the best for themselves.
That's how you elect your leaders to direct the state, but the state is you as a collective.
Right.
I thought she said that because she didn't have kids.
No, if every citizen decide not to follow the directive of the state, what would happen to the state?
Collapse.
It would collapse. It wouldn't cease to exist. Okay, the citizens actually give power to the states, so the state can get to state leaders, so they can get organized people to get something done. There's no different than the village chief.
It's called human capital, and that's the term for it. Yeah. I think getting into a conversation of nation building would be beneficial so that people can understand the layers of infrastructure and how that works. Because I don't think
No, if you go back to the first tribe, right? All a state is an extension of the tribe and the tribal leader. Okay, that's all it is. It's no different. Okay, you all it is scale. You've scaled
You scale it up.
you've scaled it up. It's the same thing. If basically you elect a tribal chief that's supposed to be the wisest or the most capable person, most just, and to actually settle disputes and organize people, right? And that's what you do. And if you scaled it up to a kingdom, to an empire, to a state, it's the same thing.
Same thing. Okay, I got you.
So
but I think Kareem,
so the state is you.
I think Kareem was trying to say something.
Did you say something?
Go ahead.
Yeah,
No,
hold up,
what
Zulu.
I was saying when you talked about Melissa Perry, when I heard that, I thought that because she couldn't have kids, because I think her daughter is adopted.
She has a daughter.
Yeah, I think she's adopted though. I think her daughter's adopted. But I understand what you were saying now. Maybe I was just wrong in my interpretation of what you were saying.
If I can find it, because YouTube did take it down. There was a French philosopher, feminist philosopher, as a matter of fact, that is in France, right? She spoke it in French, and she actually said at the very beginning that she was telling women that the children don't belong to you. You're actually having children for the state.
Yep. She said that, or did she say it in a roundabout way? Because I think
no. It was pretty direct. If you think about it, if you have a kid, what value do you get out of that child other than emotional?
I guess an emotional, and I guess maybe to help you out in your more elderly years, but that's probably it.
Who gets the most value out of that child once you educate them?
The state does. Definitely.
The state does. That's how come the state step in, educates the kid, make sure the kid gets a certain amount of welfare, a minimum amount of
food
or whatever, so it can survive. Because once they get 18 years old and they live to be 68, basically 50 years of their value is going to be in the state. Okay?
That's why there's so much pushback on school choice.
Yeah,
that's why there's so much pushback on that. Because there are many proponents that believe that the state is the best arbiter of the direction of your child.
I gave you a link in the back chat.
If you look at where the Jarawa tribe actually, which is ancient civilization or ancient society, right? Going back 150,000 years, right? Okay, they practice something similar to the 10 years doctrine, right? Basically, the kids belong to the parents for the first 7 years, and then after 7 years, the boy or the girl will actually go to a girl's tent or settlement, not settlement, but organization, and the boys will go to a boys organization because it's rights. Well, just to raise them all the way up to being an adult. Okay, training. Okay, because those make up the citizens or the people that the village actually needs. So the children have always belonged to the village or belonged to the society rather than to the individual parents. Basically, where we got the individualism of where the children belong to the parents was, and when we had agriculture, because then you actually needed children to actually work on the land because you were actually getting some kind of labor out of that child. So the child was valuable because the more kids, more employees necessarily that you had, the more wealth that you actually gained. That's when children became wealth as far as an individual. If that makes sense.
Perfect sense.
Okay. All right. BGS drift over. Back to you.
So I wanted to emphasize
back to your programming.
I wanted to emphasize the last point on here, just like BGS was saying earlier. Epigenetics is literally just a portion of the algorithm. It's not the final solution. It's not the end result, but it is a modality that explains things and is a useful tool to assist in problem solving and a useful lens to observe potential solutions in the immediate and down the line. It can explain some things that we may observe down the line, and it may explain some things that you can observe in your immediate surroundings with yourself and your family. And I think it was a very relevant point to bring up when we were examining the tradition of the baby farms, specifically as it relates to the Ados tribe, because to me, it explained everything to me at that point, because I didn't see a difference between that kind of environment and artificial selection. And when we start talking like that, you begin to see very clearly the true damage that institution caused and the true issues that we're having to deal with on a recurring basis that do present a way of solving, but it's going to require a fundamental re-evaluation of the way we look at this.
Definitely.
Okay, so gentlemen, just for context, so the algorithm of how communities are made, or how generations are made, is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
As far as okay.
As far as the relationship with how events in the past play out gene expression down the line, and how it not only affects the individual that experienced it, but how it can experience next generation subsequent after that. Just due to the way, certain genes being methylated through the conditioned response, the link we gave earlier, for example, with epigenetic mechanisms and fear conditioning, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't even have to just be fear. It could be any behavioral conditioning can be passed on like that on an epigenetic level, and then create these hormonal imbalances like we were talking about earlier with things like cortisol, particularly during developmental stages of childhood, and being in hostile environments where you've got the requisite of the environment being hostile to create these things, and then having a genetic predisposition in the form of it being passed on epigenetically through the women.
So basically, doesn't that mean, like, basically I kind of explain why from my understanding, why people in the Philippines are so short. Like, I understand why they're so short, but basically you just explaining necessarily like through gene expression and let's say the quote unquote the environment and whatnot, and things that happen in quote unquote environment will basically express how your genes will have to react necessarily to keep you alive in instead of area, correct?
Like certain African tribes can, like on West Africa, we're lactose intolerant, right? But East Africa, they're not. Okay, because of the foods, different types of foods that they eat. So that's
right.
Gene expression being passed down to other generation to the children.
Okay. So and they're showing that even in the microbiome, which is why I want to have that part 2 with Dr. Anwar, if he's cool with it, down the line, because I think that's an excellent tool to help address some of these issues that epigenetics can show itself in. Yes, definitely with the food you eat, definitely with microbiome. It can even affect your psychology because they're using the microbiome to treat psychological ailments currently. Like, it's a thing. They can use it to induce depression. They can use it to fix depression. They can use it to treat things going on with obesity and overweight situations. They're even using it for some cancer circumstances, as both a vector for treatment. In other words, a way that they can manipulate the biome to produce a desired result, or just, providing something that's generally lacking, because we find out that there's a sympathetic response where certain bacteria in our stomach actually create the vitamin that our body turns around and needs by breaking down foods we have. Like, you can take, let's just generically call it collard greens. You eat collard greens, and then a bacteria that's in your stomach can convert that to a vitamin you actually need that's not even in the freaking collard greens. Like, that's how a symbolic or a symbiotic relationship.
Wait, is that even? Wait. Is that? Yeah, I'm sorry. Is that even possible? Because basically, you just told me that if you eat something that you don't have, it basically gave you a nutrient that you didn't have that wasn't in the food.
Yes. If you stay alive, your body will find a way to synthesize anything that it needs. Okay.
And that's a process. Yeah. BGS and Dr. Dunbar, literally, that's their job, to observe biochemistry at a level like that. That's a thing. It's why it needs other requisite ingredients like carbon and magnesium. So when you take a supplement for that, for example, or eat foods that have a natural disposition towards that, the bacteria will consume that, and the byproduct is the actual resource your body needs, and then it absorbs that through the colon line, and that's how we get a lot of the resources that we need. In fact, even a lot of the drugs that are created, they'll use E. coli as a vector to overexpress certain things. That's epigenetics right there. Like, that's probably part of Anwar's job all day. Like, this isn't anything that's necessarily new. It's just that I don't think we've talked about how a lot of this plays a role with what's going on in our behavior. So anything that's traveling up and down that vagus nerve, which, that's the hormone regulator. That's what determines your automatic functions. It's where a lot of autoimmune issues happen. It's where, a lot of homeostasis is involved in that. And that's a direct connection from your head to your stomach. It's such an important dynamic that to not talk about it will kind of be a disservice to folks if they want to change their condition, especially on an immediate level. And it can play out on an overall macro level by virtue of their food culture, leading to changes like BGS talked about, where because you've got field herding cultures in Eastern Africa, like the Bantu peoples overall, and a lot of folks in Ethiopia, they developed that lactose enzyme from consuming it over and over again. That is an epigenetic change. The bacteria in the gut biome literally take on the mRNA, the messenger RNA, and they can implement that sequence into the way they break that down and create the enzyme to digest it, at least digest it better. And you see that with folks that moved out of Africa and went further north and followed some of those tribes, which is why
you almost made me want to change majors, man.
I'm just saying, this is all common knowledge in the biological field. They've been talking about this for years. And, you know, we're very far behind on this because now they're taking this same principle and they're applying it to different treatments to deal with common issues, again, like mental disorders. And even that's part of how we got the current vaccine, you know, with what we know about mRNA and stuff like that. But
you're trying to, instead of working with a natural process, you're trying to mechanize it, trying to turn it into a machine-like mechanism where you just, you know, just like a computer, you know, instead of adding in your head, you turn to a calculator, actually mechanize the process. That's what they're attempting to do.
And I'm digressing slightly, but I'll tie this back into transhumanism again. This is exactly where nanotechnology is heading towards, where they can make the nanotech basically behave like mRNA and miRNA. Basically, you've got machines that can script proteins.
Yeah, you mimic it. Yeah, you can. You do.
So basically, we're talking about. I don't know if anybody else has played this game before. Halo before, basically, when you had Cortana necessarily, but she was a robot. She was an entity in his head necessarily, but
she was a program running in his hardware. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So Cortana just smaller, but you know.
Cortana is not an entity. Cortana is an artificial intelligence, right?
Yes, exactly.
And basically, since he has a neural link because of the way he was designed, she's actually part of his psyche because he's integrated. Like if you actually played Halo, right, and talked about the Spartans,
how do you know about Halo?
because how do I know about Halo? How old are you, man?
It's been around, fam.
It's been around for 20 years. It's been around 20 years, man. Yeah, I played the first Halo. Yeah.
God damn, okay.
So in other words, I actually read the books.
Oh, God damn.
The lore books got a lot of info that break the technology.
They have a lot more info how the Spartans were actually designed, but the Spartans were actually designed to actually fit the suit. They had the Halo suit.
Yes,
right?
I know.
And so they had to design the Spartans to actually had the reflexes the muscles, but also the reflexes, the neural reflexes actually keep up with the suit, right? And then they actually put a neural link in there with the suit. So basically, if you see a Spartan is normally not outside of his suit because him and the suit are actually one. And his artificial intelligence is actually part of the suit. So Cortana is actually artificial intelligence, and is also a link between him and the suit and his outside environment. So Cortana is actually almost like his alter ego. So Cortana, in fact, there was one story where Cortana actually got separated from the Master Chief, right? And Cortana was actually dying because she cannot survive without him. So and he's not as effective without her. So he had to go find her and bring her back. Yeah. So basically, she's actually artificial intelligence designed to be his alter ego. Basically, Cortana. Basically, if you look at esoteric philosophy, Cortana is his anima, is his female side. His dark side actually controls all the stuff that his conscious mind can't. That's what she actually did. That's how come he gave him a female AI, because she's exactly his anima. She controls all the hidden stuff that he can't control. And she speaks to him, and she doesn't make decisions for him. He makes the decisions. He tells her what to do, but she actually supposed to give him information and do the stuff that he can't.
Yeah. Okay.
Anyway, but that's probably way
we
more than you wanted to know about Halo.
We could probably draw some links to transhumanist concepts that are in a lot of sci-fi, because these things are already being talked about in the cognitive pillar of transhumanism.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to really make that point. I digress slightly, just to emphasize again, epigenetics is a vector. And if we understand that the environment plays a role in the way your DNA is expressed, you can understand that your DNA is not a death sentence. And you do have agency to direct yourself to a much greater degree than what a lot of people talk about. And there are a lot of technologies that are being made currently designed to do precisely that. And if you don't take a level of awareness and agency over that now, you're going to be left out of the conversation. Like, we already are being left out, but we need to start talking about these things, because this really brings back a renewed emphasis on something really you said a while ago, BGS. And I really think this is the question. ADOS has to decide whether or not they want to be a tribe or not. Yeah, otherwise, it's a wrap. And
I think they decided, but we'll have to see. And I want to tell Last Zulu, if you really understand Halo and the Spartans, go read. Don't go look at the movie. Go get the book, Starship Troopers.
I read all of the books. Trust me. Like
no. Go back and read Starship Troopers, the book. Now, don't look at the movie. Look at the book, because the book is where the suit actually starts. Because there's a suit that the same suit that the Spartans wear was actually talked about in Starship Troopers in the book. But you got to get the book.
Starship Troopers. Wasn't that that old movie in like 19 something?
But the book is even older than that. Book is in the 40s by Heinlein. He actually wrote it in the 50s. Okay, go get the book. Go get the audio book, or get the book Starship Troopers. That's where the suit actually comes in. You understand the suit?
Okay, guys. So
right.
in the 20 minutes, we'll go for about 20 more minutes, and then I'll shut it down. Can one of you expound upon the statement about the ADOS tribe has to decide if it wants to be a tribe in the context of what we're talking about?
You want to go first, Name, or you want me to go first?
We'll go ahead, and I'll fill in the blanks.
Okay. Since we actually a created class, through slavery, right? And when our usefulness, for the better part of lack of a better term, when our usefulness as a bottom class was actually used up, they had to integrate us, and they started the integration process, the admixture process, in 1945, and basically it's been a slow. Normally, admixture takes about 300 to 400 years, but this is a forced admixture, just like the Native Americans was a forced admixture. In fact, if you think about it, I think there was like 40-50 million Native Americans when the Europeans got here. How many are there now, and what do they look like? Do they actually look like they used to look?
No, they look all mixed. I don't think no actual Native Americans actually exist. They look like those are probably like mestizos at best.
They've been mixed. They've been blended. They've been admixed into the collective, right? And it's a lot harder to do with the African Americans, with the ADOS, as we call them. I prefer to call them what the class that we are, Negro. It's hard to do with the Negro.
I prefer ADOS, but whatever.
No, well, you can say ADOS. ADOS really doesn't mean anything. The class that they gave us, the class that we created, is still
Negro. It's still Negro. I only use that just for the conversational use of it in the space, because people know what we're talking about.
So basically the admixture of the Negro started like 4 generations ago. And I said that to get a complete cultural change, I go by the 7-generation rule, right? They said that any cultural change will take 7 generations. That's what the Native Americans say. So if you take 7 generations and you start with the boomers, you go to X, you go to millennials, you have Z's, they're the 4th, right? They're the middle, they're the pivot, right? So whatever the Z's decide is what the way the culture is actually going to go, or what's left of it. So if the Z's decide they're going to go all in and admix with Latino, with white, with Asian, 2 generations from now, what are you going to see? What are you going to have?
Oh, it's a wrap. I can already tell you that.
It's a wrap. It's a wrap. So, and that's what he's saying. At some point, ADOS is going to have to decide whether they're going to be a separate, keep a separate culture, a separate class, a separate people, and rather than admix into the dominant culture. That's what he's trying to say. I do believe that's what you're trying to say, right, Nameless?
Yeah, and I said that because, again, you made the statement a while ago about, the Black community has to decide whether or not it's going to be a community or not. And, if we understand that the gatekeepers to that is going to be the women, that's where it has to begin at. If we use the women as any indicator and we see the direction of, or rather the decision that the men are making about the women also in Generation Z, it's a whole bunch of no bueno. And it looks like the only people left having this conversation really is the boomer and X generation. After that, millennials aren't going to be in a position. They're not going to have capital or the ability to influence any change because they're already spoken for at this point. It's going to be Z, and specifically the peak of alpha. Yeah. and what I see from alpha right now is they're running headfirst into what I talked about earlier about the conversation about the disgendering of society in general from a cultural level as we recognize it. And they may not even be compatible as far as the conversation is concerned between the Z's and the alphas. I don't know. I think they're going to be the first group of people to experience their children fully being co-opted by the hive dynamic in the state. I think it's going to start with alpha. Yeah.
That's going to be and Gigi talked about this. Dr. Gigi talked about this. He's called from Heidegger, which is thrownness, right? You can only adapt to the environment that you're thrown in, that you put into. And if that's all that you know, that's all that you experience, guess what what your culture is going to be like. It's going to be exactly that.
Yep. There's no buffer. There's no counterexample for alpha to follow at all.
No,
I don't see.
So I'm sorry. Continue.
Go ahead, Z. All
right. So I like that. So basically, I was just in my mind. I was like, alrighty. I would necessarily was trying this quote unquote save the ADOS, trying necessarily. The only way I was trying to figure out maybe if you can get like I ain't gonna say a highly good selective, but you get a decent selective of men and let's say women. You get some women from an outside African group necessarily. Change the rules to how y'all necessarily interact with each other necessarily and the world around you, and then therefore
it would work.
Do some other whatnot, and then basically that's the only way I was seeing it.
It would work, but guess what? People would have to do. They have to accept it.
Right.
If the Generation Z and alphas men would accept women the way they were, then it probably wouldn't be that big of a problem. What if they don't?
No. When I mean is for like, okay, well, I'm 28. I was already looking at this process of, all right, I was going to get me an African woman. I already told some of my family and said he already went to African got some women. So necessarily, and how we was working, well, I was planning on working was buy your land, necessarily get your we already had our finances to a decent level, but we trying to get our finances to a stronger level necessarily to the point that we can actually fight off smaller necessarily threats and whatnots, and then therefore have those women necessarily capitulate to what our standards and how we necessarily want those, and therefore have it within our own group or selective people that we actually invite, if we could necessarily invite enough people in, have that be its own contained little community, and then start building up from there. But other than that, you can't necessarily do that, you basically fuck. And after that, and basically that's how I was trying to do it, but that's a lot of forethought and finances and understanding of the world around you and stuff. I don't see that a lot of people having that.
And it's basically okay. Admix started in the United States in 45, right? It's taken them to get to this point, right? Which seems kind of small, right? It took them 80 years and trillions of dollars, okay, to persuade people over time to actually do this, right? And we're talking about the state that has control of the laws, the money, the power, the schools, media, all this kind of stuff, right? And for you to do it as an individual or an individual group of people, without all that stuff, without the money, without the controls, without the laws, that's a tough ask, man. You can do it on a small scale,
like
small scale. I couldn't no massive scale.
I said, but the thing is, if you even on a small scale, basically would be just like the Native Americans on a reservation.
But I mean, that's real talk, fam. Like you gotta look at it. We're already getting outpaced by the Asian demographic. Already.
In what way? You talking about by
numbers, sheer presence and numbers.
Yeah, but a lot of them are imported.
I mean, that's kind of
right.
hard.
We know why, but I'm saying it's happening, and they're going adjacent to us. It's not like they go off in this, rural America. They're right next to us when this happens, and if we understand that they have more gravitas economically, legally, and politically than we do, they're the ones terraforming the environments we're living in. Term a lot of people use for that is gentrification. We're subject to that constantly because we're the subject of power. Generally speaking, we only ever exercise power in group, and generally speaking, that goes along genders. So this is what I mean about, we're back to 1965 Moynihan. Are we going to actually do what's required to reestablish homeostasis or not? And the answer that seems to be overwhelmingly put forward is no, but there's some who do. And the ones who do need to understand this info, and they need to speak up and get identified, because every month this stuff continues to progress. We're that much behind everybody else who, if their family dynamics are intact, they get to engage this new paradigm with a solid base and structure and lead ahead of everybody else that will last for generations.
Build your reservation. If you really want to keep the culture alive, where it's remaining, you have to build your reservation. Just like the Amish did, right? The Amish have preserved basically German rural German culture for 200-300 years. But the thing is, they have to isolate themselves. And even then, the outside environment is actually, so slowly but surely shrinking their population.
I mean, it's seeping in.
I'm seeing them in the airport. Like they take planes. They use modern technology. They got phones.
Yeah.
So
I mean, they try to keep the creep to a minimum, but eventually the environment's going to overtake them. The cultural environment's going to overtake them.
So then by that logic, then necessarily it's already there, regardless of what you do.
It probably is, but the thing is, being nameless, and I'm sure Dr. Dunbar don't say it because we don't want to, there's always.
I'm not trying to kill hope.
Oh,
I just wanted to be real.
I left that go when I figured I was going to die. So
well, that's why we can't change what's happening, right? But you can change how you respond to it. And I think that my thing is, I think a lot of people don't understand the amount of things or variables that are involved that they do have control over. Yeah. For example, there's too many people I come across that are still under the presuppositions that were presented with eugenics, i.e., just because we were born black, there's a lot of us that think we're genetically inferior.
Yeah, because you've been told that. You've been told that by society.
That's psychological brainwashing. That's different from genetics.
Well, if it's widespread, what's the difference then?
What's the difference? Yeah.
And we're talking about this, but listen to what I'm saying. We're talking about, and that's how culture can work. I mean, that's the cultural meme. Superorganism is what I wanted to talk about, BGS. We need to have a conversation on that one day about the superorganism, because I think that's an excellent way to describe the hive dynamic that's going on, the cultural memes that take place with that, and how a lot of this plays out in the background. Because again, epigenetics is a useful tool to be able to correct for a lot of the problems we're experiencing right now. It's about that agency, which is why we're talking about it. But again, it's emphasizing why, because the environment, specifically that outer epidermis of the civilization, is changing so fast that the conversations that are being had now are being had in a lag period where the actual field that we're discussing doesn't even exist anymore. And we need to be having a conversation about where it's headed, and we're still stuck on what's actually not even there anymore, which is what makes this conversation frustrating when we talk about, quote, what are we going to do about the community? Because most of that is already gone. And I don't think people understand or appreciate how fast this is going to change. When you've got an opportunity like Generation Alpha coming up with disassociated Generation Z that's going to be raised literally by an algorithm. An algorithm is going to raise generation alpha. And what's that going to say about generation beta when they show up? And that's when that's the AI era.
AI era, and it's artificial wombs, all kind of stuff will show up then.
The family conversation has to be done at a 1% level now for it to be relevant. And we're still stuck on it on a gregarian society level. We think there's a farm waiting for us to argue about how we're going to run it when all of that's already accounted for, because the farm is about to be in people's brains.
Yeah, and the farm to survive in farming, even now, even subsistence farming, you're going to have to bring in tech.
Yep. Well, it's already happening. We know that, but we don't know that, like in aggregate. So
because we're still fighting a as far as
poverty. From my understanding.
No. Actually, we're fighting a 21st century problem with a 19th century mindset.
Yep,
that's what we're doing, and trying to get black people out of that, and that 19th century mindset is very difficult. Yeah, so we can't. So we have to go to get them out of the 19th century mindset, bring them into the 20th century, and then try to bring them up to speed on what's going to happen in the 21st century.
Basically, well, I mean, from my understanding, like I told Nameless earlier, so basically it comes back to the money.
No, because the money don't mean nothing if you don't know how to direct it.
Money. This is not about money. This is about cultural, environmental, and biological evolution that has nothing to do with money, because it's going to encompass everybody. So it has nothing to do with money. Who has the money? Okay.
It's like you can determine how you respond to a disaster, but once it's in motion, there's nothing you can do. And that's essentially that ounce of preparedness versus a pound of reaction. You know, that's where we're at right now. The individuals that can head this off and lead it off are going to be postured so much better to deal with these changes on all levels, not just one. Money's not going to buy you out of this.
Yeah, it's not gonna buy you out of it. And plus when you shape an environment and you shape a society, right? Your top 1.1% that should lead the country, they're actually shaped by it too. They can't escape the effect.
What I mean when I mean money, I mean necessarily because, like you said, you're trying to quote unquote catch the group up necessarily to a certain level. You need school, so which means you need money. That means you need textbooks, which you mean you need computers.
No, because we have the internet, fam. And
you
social media.
You basically okay. I'm in Los Angeles, right?
And I'm in Georgia.
You which part? Atlanta.
God.
I mean, it makes a difference because the bigger the city, the more resources you have.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, Georgia. Yeah.
So in other words, I'm saying I'm in a loss. I wasn't saying just where I'm at as a city to make a big difference, right? The thing is, how much money does the state spend on each student? And the state spends like $20,000 per student in Los Angeles. It's probably higher than that, right? The money is there. How do you allocate it, and what systems do you put in to actually maximize the dollars that you get? You have the money. The money's there. The money's given to you by the state. How do you allocate it? How do you amplify it? How do you enhance it? And that's the biggest problem I get from people. It's not the money. The money is there. I actually talked to a teacher in Philadelphia, right? And she's from Philly, and we talked about. And this was like, God, it's 2008. I do believe it was 2008. So that's a long time ago. I'm getting old, but at that time, each student in Philadelphia was getting they're actually allocating $21,000 per student, right? The money is there. You can send a kid to college for that kind of money, right? So if you actually marry, and me and Nameless we've been talking about this stuff for years, right? Yeah, okay. If you a lot of that money is getting pinched off, right? In teachers and administrators, blah blah blah, pensions, whatnot, right? But if you streamline it and you get the right mix of the internet, technology, AI, and physical teachers, okay, you can cut the price, cut the amount that you need to teach that kid in half, okay,
or
in
less.
half, or less. Yeah, in half. Okay, so it's not about having money. Okay, it's about how you allocate the money. The money's there.
Oh no, my bad. I thought it was necessarily about that if you wanted to quote unquote push yourself or get people up to speed necessarily along with that, you would need to have control of the school necessarily. Which means 9 times out of 10, if you're not on the quote unquote the nation's objective, or you're not going directly into the nation's objective, you probably want to go get that funding.
And who controls your school boards? Because when money's allocated, as long as you reach certain meet certain metrics, basically the federal government's not going to bother you. Okay, you have a lot of autonomy as how you fashion your school board.
Really?
Okay, yes, you do.
Ultimately, we're looking at culture at the end of the day, because you can't fix culture with money.
No.
There needs to be a conscious decision by the people where, generally speaking, the environment has to be so harsh that it forces you in a particular direction in general. And until things get so bad that there's no choice, I don't see it changing so much so, but I don't see a reason not to present this information while it's available to those who will listen and can make use of it in their everyday life, especially if they have families they care about and they want to have an idea of what's coming downstream. They can at least have a heads up. They can at least have an understanding of how they need to articulate these conversations when we have the quote community conversation end quote, and understand what's at stake. Because again, I think it's important to illustrate that we are speaking about a modern era scenario, and people are still using the time frame of reference we had when we were on the plantation still. And the environment has changed so much. And we've been enjoying the benefit of this, of basically being in a first world country, the way we are as a superpower, that we haven't had to know these things are changing on the outside, that we are lagging behind on a level that's unprecedented. It's not just us, it's the United States as a whole, really. The average American citizen is suffering from this, but us in particular, we are literally stuck in a cultural capsule, time capsule, of being fresh off the plantation, as though that is the era we have to decide, or having to start the family dynamic off the strength of that. We're having to really start from a scenario where calling people human beings is the new civil rights conversation. And we're not ready for that because we're still stuck on who's supposed to be in the kitchen cooking.
Well,
and that's what we're talking about. That's the cultural dynamic. There is no throwing money to fix that. There is presenting reality, and there's making a decision on whether you're going to accept the reality or you're going to accept the narrative that you were conditioned to.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm going to wrap up. BGS, go say what you're going to say. Last Zulu, if you have one more question for Nameless and BGS, go ahead afterwards.
I've learned a lot, so I'm just going to definitely balance that. Thank you. I appreciate it from Nameless, Dr. Dunbar, and selling BGS, and I appreciate all the information I was able to gain and whatnot. And thank you for answering my question. I appreciate it.
And we're gonna stop Dr. Dunbar from hiding behind that PhD and come and throw some elbows, man. He done been back there quiet, hiding behind that doctorate, man. No, you gotta come and throw some elbows, Doc. You can be wrong. It's okay. You can be wrong. We're not gonna hold it against you. I said Dr. Dunbar ain't saying shit. Boy, he's back there hiding behind that PhD, man. Throw some elbows, Doc. Hey, Doc, I talked to Charles, man. I'm not happy about him getting you in all this trouble going to Baltimore, man. I'm not happy about that, man. Okay, I like my Dr. Dunbar. I don't mind Dr. Goodbar, man, but I don't want to have to fly to Baltimore and take on Charles, man. You ain't gonna just totally corrupt my good Dr. Dunbar, man. Come on now.
Well, the next project is get my arms as big as his.
Oh shit! It's a wrap. It's a wrap. He's gone. He's gone. You might as well go ahead and go down to and change the last name to Goodbar, man, and just forget it.
got that stiff energy in him, man. We call him, was it Ziff Dunbar or something like that? Darth Zumbar or something? He's gone, man.
No, he's gone. He's gone. Dr. Dr. Anwar Goodbar, PhD, motherfucker. Here's my card.
You got to say the whole thing.
Yeah,
it's like a Tribe Called Quest.
I can see it now. He gets drunk. I'm Dr. Anwar Goodbar, PhD, motherfucker.
Oh shit! I'm getting back here, man.
Oh boy.
All right. Do you guys have anything else you want to say?
Nah. That was my closing thought.
All right.
Me and Charles gonna have to have words, man. Okay, we can't have this kind of stuff going on, man. I said,
Doc and the cop.
Yeah, Doc and the cop. That's right. That's what he says. The Doc and the cop. I don't know, man. Don't get corrupted, man, because he can corrupt you, man. He's a thought. You got to remember, he's a male thought.
Either way, I'll be on the right side of the law.
I see what you did, Dar.
And we gonna shake our heads. I said we want. He ain't the same guy that we once knew, man. What happened? And your mother's gonna shake her head like, what? My boy. Where'd he go wrong?
Yeah, I'm gonna take some cigars and cognac home.
And get them all them hey big head calls, huh?
Yep.
That's facts.
All right.
Anyway,
thank you, Master Teacher. Nameless, definitely. Yeah, we gotta do this again. Maybe we'll tackle the gut biome next time.
Yeah, that'll be some good overlap, especially with your background. Maybe you'll find a lot of good resources that most folks may not have readily available access to. So I definitely look forward to that. Okay.
Well, thank you for coming through.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. To you and folks in the chat. Thanks for listening.
All right, everyone. Thank you for those of you who are new. If you're watching this on the playback, please like, share, and subscribe. Also, if you want to donate, that information will be below this video as well. I left 2 resources that Nameless shared with me. I left that piece I read at the beginning about how technology is changing how the human brain is operating. And I left 3 TED Talks on epigenetics. So look out for more of these. Please like, share, and subscribe. And I will talk to you next time. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday. And as always, remember that your attitude determines your altitude. Take care, and I'll talk to you the next time. Bye-bye.